What happens when the most powerful woman in the city accidentally calls the janitor honey in front of her entire board of directors? She expected silence, maybe an apology, maybe the man to disappear. Instead, he looked up from his toolbox and said exactly what no one in that room had ever dared to say to her face, and nothing was ever the same again. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels, and if you stay until the end, hit that like button. Every single one tells me you were here. The fluorescent light in Corridor 7 had been flickering for 11 days. Ethan Cross knew this because he was the one who'd filed the maintenance request, been ignored, filed it again, been ignored a second time, and finally shown up at 6:15 in the morning to fix it himself before his shift technically started. Because that was the kind of man he was. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone noticed, but because a flickering light in a hospital corridor meant someone with a headache or grief or a diagnosis they weren't ready to hear had to walk through that strobing half-darkness to get wherever they were going, and he didn't think that was okay. He was 40 minutes into the job when his phone buzzed. Not his work phone. The other one, the prepaid he kept in his left breast pocket, always on silent except for one contact. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson says I need money for the field trip tomorrow. It's $8. He read it twice. Then he pulled out his wallet and counted what was in there. $14 and change, plus a gas station receipt he'd been meaning to throw away for 2 weeks. He typed back, "You'll have it. Love you. Eat your breakfast." He didn't tell her he'd been eating peanut butter crackers for lunch 3 days running. She was 8. She didn't need to know. No. Ethan Cross was 32 years old, and he had the hands of a man who'd been working with them since he was 16. Not in a romantic way. Not in the way people describe in movies, where someone's rough palms are a sign of salt-of-the-earth nobility or whatever. His knuckles were permanently discolored from an incident with a pipe fitting 2 winters ago. His right thumb had a scar from a box cutter that had slipped while he was cutting drywall. His index finger on his left hand sat at a slight angle, healed wrong after he broke it during a particularly bad stretch when he couldn't afford an emergency room copay and had taped it himself and hoped for the best. He was not a tragic figure. He would have been annoyed if you'd called him one. He had a job. He had his daughter. He had a 1-bedroom apartment in the Eastfield district that was small enough that he'd converted the walk-in closet into a second bedroom for Lily, complete with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and a little wooden shelf he'd built himself for her books. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. His wife Claire had been gone for 4 years. He didn't talk about it. Not to coworkers, not to his supervisor, barely to his mother when she called on Sundays. What was there to say? She got sick, they fought it, they lost. Lily had been 4 years old and had called for her mother for 6 months after, and Ethan had answered every single time by just sitting on the floor outside her door until she fell back asleep, because there was nothing to say. There were no words that fixed it. You just showed up. You just kept going. He'd gotten licensed in electrical work, plumbing, HVAC, general contracting. Not a degree. He didn't have a degree and couldn't afford one, and frankly hadn't had the time or mental space for night school while also raising a child and keeping a job. But certifications. Papers that said he knew what he was doing, that he wasn't going to burn someone's building down. He'd been working contract maintenance for 6 years through a company called Allied Field Services, which meant he went wherever they sent him, fixed whatever needed fixing, and went home. Sometimes the jobs were interesting. Mostly they weren't. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday. Cross. His supervisor, a guy named Ron, who communicated primarily through clipped single-syllable words and forwarded emails, had called him just after lunch. "You do electrical?" "I'm licensed." "Novacore Technologies." "Got an emergency call. Their main conference floor's got a partial panel failure. Half the floor's on backup power. They've got a board meeting tonight, and their usual guy can't get there until tomorrow." Ethan had heard of Novacore. You'd have to have been living in a cave not to. It was one of those companies that had exploded in the past 5 years. AI integration systems, enterprise software, something that apparently made other companies able to run more efficiently and at scale. He didn't fully understand what they actually did, but he understood they were worth a lot of money, and that their office was on the 34th floor of the Callaway Tower downtown. I can be there by 2, he said. They need someone by 1:30. Then I can be there by 1:25. A pause. Don't be weird about it. These people are important. I know how to do my job, Ron. He packed his secondary kit from the truck. He kept 2, one for residential and one for commercial, because commercial panels were a different animal entirely, and drove downtown with NPR on the radio, half listening to a segment about supply chain disruptions while mentally reviewing what a partial panel failure on a backup system usually looked like and what parts he'd need. He did not think about the CEO of the company. He did not think about anything except the job. Novacore Technologies occupied floors 32 through 35 of the Callaway Tower, and the lobby alone told you everything you needed to know about how much money they had. Marble floors, real marble, not the composite tile that looked like marble until you got close. A reception desk that was a single piece of curved glass, backlit in pale blue. 2 security guards who were better dressed than Ethan on his best day. He told them who he was. One of them made a call. There was a wait while someone verified him with Allied Field Services. He stood there with his toolbox and his work shirt that said Ethan, maintenance, above the left breast pocket, and didn't fidget, because he'd learned long ago that if you stood like you belonged somewhere, people mostly left you alone. A woman in a charcoal blazer came out to escort him. She introduced herself as Monica, administrative coordinator, she said, not assistant, and he noted the distinction. She was moving at the kind of pace that said she had approximately 12 things to do, and he was number 7 on the list. The panel room is through here. I have to warn you, the executive team is in a pre-meeting on the conference floor right now, so there will be people around. Just keep the disruption minimal. I'll need access to the main breaker closet and any subpanels on this floor. Yes, I was told. She swiped her badge at a door labeled Electrical, Authorized Access, and held it open. The failure started around 11 this morning. It's affecting the east wing of the 34th floor, the main conference room, 3 smaller meeting rooms, and the executive corridor. How old's the panel? I don't know. Any recent renovations to this floor? We expanded about a year ago. There was construction. He nodded. That was probably the culprit right there. Whoever had done the renovation work had likely overloaded the existing circuits without properly redistributing the panel loads. It was one of the most common problems he saw in commercial spaces, and it was almost always the result of whoever oversaw the renovation going cheap on the electrical subcontract. I'll let you know what I find, he said. Monica nodded like she both appreciated this and fully expected to not hear from him again until the work was done. Then she disappeared. The panel was exactly what he'd expected, a mess. Someone had run additional circuits off a breaker that was already at capacity, which meant the panel had been quietly struggling for months, probably since the renovation, and it had finally given out under the load of the conference equipment being set up for the evening meeting. Added to that, there was a loose neutral connection on the main bus bar that looked like it had been that way for a while. Dry, oxidized, the kind of thing that made electricians nervous because it was the kind of thing that caused fires. He photographed everything. Then he got to work. He'd been at it for about 40 minutes, kneeling on the floor with the panel cover off and his voltage meter in his hand, when he heard it. The voice came through an intercom speaker mounted above the door, small, nearly invisible, the kind of thing that got installed and then everyone forgot about. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but the voice was crisp and clear and carried the particular kind of authority that meant whoever was speaking was used to being listened to immediately. Not interested in excuses, Marcus. The Helion presentation needs to be ready by 7. Not ready-ish, not mostly done. Ready. And I need the revised shareholder projections on my desk before that meeting starts, which means I need them now, which means you needed to have started 2 hours ago. Do we understand each other? A pause. Then, in exactly the same tone, casual as a weather update. Honey, can you come here for a second? Ethan did not look up from the panel. He reached for a wire nut, realized it was the wrong gauge, set it back in the tray, and picked up the correct one. Then his hand stopped. He became aware of 2 things simultaneously: that the voice had been addressing him. He was, as far as he knew, the only person in this electrical room, and that somewhere on the conference floor above him, an entire room of people had just gone very, very quiet. He could hear it through the intercom. The silence had a texture to it, the kind of silence that meant everyone in that room was either holding their breath or actively pretending to look at their phones. He set down the wire nut. He looked up at the intercom speaker. "Only if you've already eaten lunch," he said, his voice even, conversational. "Gotten some sleep and stopped working yourself into the ground." The silence that followed was a completely different kind of silence. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then a second voice came through the intercom. Male, slightly panicked, someone named Marcus, presumably, saying, "Ms. Vale, he's that's the maintenance," and the first voice cut him off. "I know who he is." She didn't sound embarrassed. That was the thing Ethan noticed, through the tinny intercom speaker and the ambient noise of the conference floor above him. She didn't sound flustered or caught out, or any of the things people usually sounded like when they just accidentally called a maintenance worker honey in front of a boardroom full of executives. She sounded intrigued, like a problem had just appeared on her desk that she hadn't anticipated and was now trying to decide if she wanted to solve it. "Tell the team to take 10 minutes, the voice said. Brisk, decisive, already moving on, and then the intercom clicked off. Sienna Vale was 30 years old, and she had been running Novacore Technologies for 2 years, having taken over after the board had, reluctantly, controversially, and ultimately correctly, chosen her over 3 older male candidates to succeed the company's founder. She was not universally liked. She was clear-eyed about this. Being universally liked was not something she'd ever had the bandwidth to pursue, and she'd made peace with that somewhere around her second year of business school when a professor had told her she was too aggressive, and she'd looked at him and said, "Compared to what?" She was respected. She was feared in some quarters. She had been on the cover of 2 business publications in the past 18 months, and had given those interviews with the wariness of someone who understood that visibility was a double-edged thing. She ran a company that employed 400 people and was worth, as of the last valuation, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.4 billion. She had not eaten lunch. She had in fact not eaten since 6 in the morning, when she'd had half a protein bar while reviewing the Helion merger documents on her phone during the car ride in. She also had not slept particularly well in approximately 3 weeks, which was its own separate issue. She walked into the electrical maintenance room 11 minutes after she'd clicked off the intercom. She'd handled 2 things first. She wasn't going to pretend she hadn't, because that was how she was built. Problem in front of her, clear the desk, then circle back. But she had circled back. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and warm metal. The maintenance worker, she'd been handed his name on a slip of paper by Monica, who had appeared from nowhere with the slightly martyred expression she wore when Sienna was doing something she considered inadvisable, was still on the floor, his legs folded under him, his attention entirely on the open panel. He looked up when she came in. She'd expected something, an apology, mortification, maybe the aggressive over-deference that some working people performed around her, all "yes ma'am" and "sorry" didn't mean anything by it, as a way of preemptively managing any potential blowback. He didn't do any of that. He just looked at her. His eyes were brown, a dark, steady brown, and there were lines at their corners that suggested either a lot of time spent squinting outdoors, or someone who'd been under pressure for a long time, or both. His face was not particularly remarkable, except that it was entirely without performance. No reading the room. No calculating. He was just looking at her the way you'd look at anyone who'd walked into the room where you were working. "Ms. Vale," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. "You realize," she said, and she kept her voice neutral, "that what you said could be interpreted as quite a few things." "I know what I said." "You're not concerned about what I might do with it?" He picked up what she understood to be a wire connector. She knew approximately nothing about electrical work, and applied it to whatever he was doing in the panel with the focus of someone who had 17 more things to do after this. "With what?" he said. "I told you to eat lunch and get some sleep. If that gets me fired, I'll take my chances." "You're not worried." "About what? You finding me replaceable?" He sat back slightly, not enough to stop working, just enough to indicate that he was capable of having a conversation and doing his job simultaneously. "I'm a maintenance contractor from Allied Field Services. I was replaceable before I walked in. This was not false. She'd worked with Allied a handful of times and had found them perfectly competent and completely interchangeable in the way that most contracted services were. That's a remarkably unbothered worldview, she said. I've got a lot to be bothered by. This isn't one of them. She stood there for a moment. In her experience, conversations went one of two ways when she chose to have them. Either the other person told her what she wanted to hear as quickly as possible, or they spent the whole time trying to figure out what she wanted to hear and delivering it in installments. Neither was particularly satisfying. This man appeared to be doing neither. What's the problem? She asked. With the panel? Yes. He explained it. He explained it clearly and without condescension, which she would not have expected. Most contractors either over-explained as if she couldn't possibly follow, or under-explained as if she couldn't possibly understand. He told her that whoever had done the renovation work the previous year had added circuits to a panel that was already near capacity, that the loose neutral connection was a more immediate concern than the overloaded breakers, because it was a potential fire hazard, and that the whole thing needed to be redistributed and the connection properly tightened and sealed before they ran anything critical off this floor. How long? She asked. The loose neutral's an hour. The redistribution is a bigger job. You're looking at probably 2 visits, today and tomorrow morning. I can stabilize everything for tonight, get you through your meeting, and come back tomorrow to do the full repair properly. The meeting is critical. I know. You'll have full power to the conference room by 5 o'clock. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. You're not from facilities, she said. Allied Field Services. Your usual guy couldn't make it. Allied usually sends someone more... She searched for the word. Corporate? I was going to say deferential. He almost smiled. It was slight, barely a shift at the corner of his mouth, and then it was gone. That's not really my thing, he said. She ordered food to the executive floor at 4:15. This was not something she typically did. She typically ate, when she ate, at her desk or in back-to-back meetings, or occasionally while standing over Monica's desk asking questions. A full lunch order for one, from the Mediterranean place on the building's ground floor, placed at 4 in the afternoon, and delivered by one of the building's internal couriers with a single sticky note that said, "Eat it." This was new. She wasn't sure why she'd done it. She told herself it was because she'd happened to be ordering something anyway. She told herself she wasn't entirely sure herself. She ate at her desk and worked through the Helion files and did not think about the maintenance worker on the floor below. She thought about him at 4:47 when Monica buzzed her to say that the East Wing had full power restored and the contractor had left a written report of the work completed and a note about the return visit scheduled for tomorrow morning. She read the report. It was thorough, more thorough than she expected. Detailed notes on the fault conditions, clear documentation of what had been done, what remained to be done, and why. Professional language, not showing off, not padding, just clear. At the bottom, in handwriting rather than typed, he'd added, "The loose neutral on the main bus bar had visible oxidation consistent with at least 6 to 8 months of thermal stress. Whoever approved the renovation electrical work last year should review their contractor's documentation. There may be other code compliance issues worth looking at." She stared at that for a moment. Then she put the report in her follow-up folder, which was where things went when they mattered, and she intended to come back to them. The board meeting went without incident. The Helion presentation landed well. Sienna fielded questions from 3 board members who were, respectively, skeptical, enthusiastic, and aggressively neutral in the way of people who hadn't made up their minds yet and didn't want anyone to know it. She gave them what they needed to land in the enthusiastic column. This was not the first time she'd done this. She got home at 9:15. Her apartment was on the 41st floor of a building 8 blocks from Novacor's offices. She'd chosen it for the proximity and the views, and she'd furnished it in the spare, minimal way of someone who lived alone and didn't particularly care about decor, but understood that spaces should be functional. There was art on the walls. She'd bought 3 pieces over the past 2 years from artists she'd met at events, not because she particularly understood art, but because she liked having things that were made by actual people, not just selected from a catalog. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen island with her laptop and worked until midnight. At some point, she remembered she was supposed to call her mother. She'd been supposed to call her mother on Tuesday, and it was now Thursday, and she made a mental note to call Saturday instead and moved on. She was good at moving on. She was very good at it. He came back at 7:30 the next morning. She knew this because Monica sent her a message saying the maintenance contractor from Allied was on site and had started on the remaining panel work. Sienna was in back-to-back calls from 7 until 10, but she was aware, in the way you became aware of something you'd told yourself you weren't thinking about, that he was somewhere on the same floor. She didn't go down. She had no reason to go down. She had calls and then a strategy session and then lunch with the VP of product development and then a raft of emails she'd been avoiding for 2 days. She had, in fact, the fullest schedule she'd had this week. At 11:45, she walked past the electrical maintenance room and the door was open and she stopped. He was packing up his kit, which meant he was almost done. The panel was closed. The floor around the workspace was cleaner than it had been when she'd walked in yesterday. He'd swept up, something he was not technically required to do. "Done?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up. "Yes." "Everything's stable? Panels redistributed? Connections sealed? Tested the load?" "You're solid." He paused. "You should have your facilities team get an electrician to look at the wiring on the floor below this one, too. Based on when this building was renovated, they probably ran the same contractor on both floors. I'll have someone look into it." "Good." He closed his kit, stood up, rolled his shoulders once in a way that said he'd been crouched for a while and felt it. There was a silence that was not awkward exactly, but had some weight to it. "You ate," she said. He looked at her. "Yesterday. The food I had sent down. I'm assuming you ate it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. "Monica left it in the break room with my name on it," he said. "Yes." "I thought that was a mistake." "It wasn't." He studied her for a moment. "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was because you told me to, and I'm not used to that, and it stuck with me, which was not something she was prepared to say out loud to a maintenance contractor at 11:45 on a Friday morning in an electrical room. "Because you were right," she said instead. "I hadn't eaten." He nodded once, accepting this without making more of it than it was. "My name's Ethan," he said. "I know. It's on your shirt." "Yeah." He picked up his kit. "Ms. Vale." "Sienna," she said. She wasn't sure why. He paused. "Ethan," he said again, and there was something almost like a question in it. "I know," she said. "You said." It. She called Allied Field Services at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She spoke with a supervisor who was, she could tell, trying very hard to sound casual about the fact that the CEO of Novacore Technologies was on his line personally. "Your contractor who came to us yesterday and this morning," she said, "Ethan Cross. I'd like to request him specifically for any future maintenance needs at our facility." "Absolutely, Ms. Vale. I can note that in your account. I'd also like to speak with your billing department about adjusting the rate for his service specifically. I don't believe what we're paying Allied reflects the quality of work we're getting." A pause. "Yes, ma'am. I can certainly, and I'll need his direct contact number for scheduling purposes." She was aware, even as she said it, that this was not entirely about scheduling purposes. She was also aware that she was Sienna Vale and had not spent a decade building a company by avoiding things that made her uncomfortable. When something was worth her attention, she paid attention to it. That was how this worked. She wrote his number on a sticky note and put it on the corner of her monitor where she could see it. She did not call it that day. She called it the following Monday, under the entirely reasonable pretense of a question about the follow-up inspection report he'd mentioned, and they talked for 18 minutes, and the thing that she noticed, quietly and filed away, was that he didn't try to be charming. He just answered the question she'd asked. He talked about the electrical systems in the same clear, unfussy way he'd explained things in person. He wasn't performing for her. He wasn't trying to figure out who she was or what she wanted or how to position himself. He was just talking to her, like a person. She'd forgotten what that felt like. Look, she called again on Wednesday. This time, there was no pretext. She asked what he was working on. He told her, a boiler replacement at a medical office building in the Riverside district, which was less interesting than it sounded, and a burst pipe situation at a restaurant downtown that had been significantly more interesting than it sounded. He asked how the board meeting had gone. She answered. They talked for 26 minutes. You don't have friends, he said at some point. Not unkindly, not an accusation, just a statement. I have colleagues, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Do you have anyone you call just to talk? She thought about this honestly. Not really, my mother, sometimes, but we mostly talk about logistics, scheduling, whether I'm eating enough. A pause. Apparently that's a theme. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, mostly suppressed. What about you? She asked. I've got a buddy, Marcus, different Marcus, from my hometown. We talk on Sundays sometimes. And my daughter. She hadn't known about the daughter. She felt something shift in the picture she'd been building. How old? 8. Her name's Lily. What's she like? He was quiet for a moment, and she could almost hear him deciding how much to say. She's the best person I know, he said finally. She's smarter than me, and she already knows it. She has opinions about everything. She got a C on a math test last month, and she was angrier at herself than her teacher was, which is going to be a whole thing later in her life, but right now I'm mostly just trying to keep up. He paused. She keeps asking when she can get a dog. What do you tell her? That the apartment's too small and the schedule's too full and that dogs deserve more than we can give them right now. And she's already started making a case for the dog she'll get when she grows up, and she's apparently planning to name him Professor. Sienna laughed. An actual laugh, not the polite, controlled kind she produced at work events. She sounds like someone I'd want to know, she said. Ethan was quiet for a beat. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Still even, still measured, but with something careful underneath it. She is, he said. She started reading about Novacore's internal systems with fresh eyes that week. This was not unusual. She reviewed internal reports constantly, but she found herself paying particular attention to the Financial Operations Division, which was under Damien Frost, her chief operating officer. Damien was 44 and had been at the company since before Sienna, had known the founder personally, and had a reputation within the company as someone who got things done and who was, in the careful language of company politics, not universally beloved by the people beneath him. She'd always found him efficient. He delivered results. He was occasionally arrogant in the way of men who'd been in a room long enough to think it belonged to them. She hadn't considered looking at him too closely. She found a discrepancy on a Thursday evening, which was how it always started. A number that didn't quite align with the report she'd read the previous week. A small thing, the kind of thing that might have been a data entry error. She spent an hour tracing it. It led to another discrepancy. And another. She closed her laptop at midnight and sat in her kitchen in the quiet, and looked at the skyline through the window, and thought about what patterns looked like when you were inside them, versus when you saw them from the outside. She thought about what Ethan had said in that brief note at the bottom of his report. There may be other code compliance issues worth looking at. It was not directly relevant. It was just that she'd been thinking about what it meant to look at something carefully and see what was actually there, instead of what you expected to find. She opened her laptop again. She kept pulling on the thread. The third time she went to find him, she didn't have a pretext at all. Allied had sent him for a routine inspection of their HVAC system. A scheduled visit, nothing to do with her. She'd known he was coming because it was in the facilities calendar, and she had not gone down to the mechanical room on the 32nd floor, and then at some point around 2 in the afternoon she had, in fact, gone to the mechanical room on the 32nd floor because she was Sienna Vale, and she didn't spend energy pretending she wasn't interested in things she was interested in. He was up a ladder with an inspection light, looking at something in the duct junction overhead. "You're going to fall," she said from the doorway. "No, I'm not. That ladder doesn't look stable." "It's fine. The feet are locked." He didn't look down. "You're not here about the HVAC. What makes you say that?" "Because you have an entire facilities team who handles this, and you came down here in a blazer and heels." She looked down at her shoes. "These are reasonable heels." "For an office, sure. For a mechanical room, not so much." He came down the ladder, folded it, and turned to face her. His inspection light was still on, clipped to his belt, and it made the shadows in the room a little strange. "What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. She was trying to figure out what she wanted to say, which was unusual for her. Sienna Vale generally knew exactly what she wanted to say. "I found something," she said finally, "in the financial reports. Something I don't like." He waited. "I'm not sure yet what it is. It might be nothing. It might be—" She stopped. "I don't have anyone I can talk to about it, not internally, and I don't want to bring in outside counsel yet because I'm not sure what I'm looking at." He was watching her with the same steady attention he gave everything, not hurrying her, not trying to fill the silence. "And you thought you talked to the maintenance guy," he said. Not unkindly, just naming it. "I thought I'd talk to someone I trust," she said. The word trust sat between them for a second, slightly exposed, the way words got when you said them before you'd fully thought through the implications. He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what you found." She told him. Not all of it. She was still working through the details, but the shape of it. The numbers that didn't line up. The reports that had been retroactively altered in ways that were subtle enough to miss unless you were looking very carefully. The pattern of what was moving and where it seemed to be going. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical and specific and not at all what she'd expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have someone inside who you trust completely?" he asked. "I don't know anymore." "Then you need to be careful," he said. "If someone's moving money and altering documentation, they've been doing it for a while, which means they've had time to get good at it. You start pulling on threads openly, they'll know." "You sound like you've dealt with this before." "I dealt with a contractor once who was skimming from the budget on a job I was working. Nothing like what you're describing, but the patterns are the same. You hide something small, you make it a habit, it gets bigger, and you keep it close enough to the center that looking at it directly makes people nervous." She stared at him. "You're a maintenance worker." "Yeah." "You're telling me to be careful like you've done corporate counterintelligence." "I'm telling you to be careful," he said, "like someone who's watched what happens when you underestimate a problem because you're too busy to look at it straight." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to offer you something," she said. "This is what you just did, the way you think about this. I need to—" "Don't," he said. "Excuse me?" "Don't offer me something. I'm not a consultant. I'm not trying to get into your orbit." He said it without heat, without resentment, just matter of fact. "I told you what I see because you asked and because it seemed like the right thing to do. That's all this is." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're genuinely not interested in what I could offer you." "I've got what I need," he said, and then quieter. "Mostly." She thought about Lily, about a 1-bedroom apartment with a closet converted into a child's room, about a man who ate peanut butter crackers for lunch so his daughter could go on a field trip. She didn't say any of this. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and turned back to the ladder. She walked back to the elevator, and she was already thinking through the financial documents, mentally sorting through what she knew and what she needed to know. But there was something underneath all of that. Something she kept sliding past and then coming back to, like a stone in a shoe. The way he'd said mostly. She was almost to the elevator when she turned back. "Ethan." He looked up. "Are you and Lily free Sunday?" she asked. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. "Why?" he said. "Because I have an unreasonable amount of space in my apartment, and I make a genuinely excellent breakfast, and your daughter apparently has opinions about everything, and I find I would like to hear some of them." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read, careful, guarded, but not closed. "I'll check with Lily," he said finally. "She has final say." Sienna almost smiled. "I'd expect nothing less." She got in the elevator. She stood in it alone as it rose, looking at her own reflection in the polished steel of the doors, and she thought, "I'm in a lot of trouble. Not the work kind. The other kind. The kind that didn't come with a boardroom strategy or a clear exit plan. The kind she'd spent 10 years building walls against, because walls were efficient and love was not. And she hadn't had the time or the bandwidth or If she was being honest, brutally, privately honest, the way she only ever was alone in an elevator, the courage. She straightened her blazer, rolled her shoulders, pressed the button for 34. She had financial documents to review and a pattern to trace and a company to protect. She was very, very good at her job, and she was also, quietly and without entirely meaning to, in quite a lot of trouble. Tut. Lily Cross had opinions about eggs. Specifically, she had opinions about the fact that Sienna Vale, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar technology company, had scrambled them wrong. You stirred them too fast, Lily said, sitting at the kitchen island on a Sunday morning with the particular authority of an 8-year-old who had decided she was comfortable enough to say what she actually thought. When you stir them too fast, they get all watery at the bottom. Sienna looked at the pan. The eggs were, in fact, slightly watery at the bottom. I see, she said. My dad does them slow. He says the secret is to almost stop stirring right at the end. Does he? He learned it from YouTube. He learns a lot of things from YouTube. He fixed our bathroom sink from YouTube. He also tried to learn to cut his own hair from YouTube, and that did not go well. From across the kitchen, where he was pouring coffee into 2 mugs like a man who was pretending he wasn't listening, Ethan said, Lily. What? It's true. You wore a hat for 2 weeks. 1 week. 2 weeks. I counted. Sienna kept her face very still because she could feel the laugh coming, and she wasn't entirely sure yet if laughing was the right move. She'd been unsure of a lot of things since 7:45 that morning when Ethan had knocked on her door with Lily beside him holding a small bag that turned out to contain, inexplicably, a library book, a drawing she'd made of something that might have been a cat or possibly a dragon, and a packet of hot cocoa mix because, she'd explained, she didn't know if Sienna had good hot cocoa or not, and she hadn't wanted to risk it. Sienna had never been brought a packet of hot cocoa mix before. She did not know exactly what to do with this information. The eggs are fine, Ethan said, setting a mug near Sienna's hand. He said it to Lily, but his eyes cut briefly to Sienna with something in them that said, You don't have to manage this. She's like this with everyone. They're a little watery, Lily said, but she was already eating them, so the critique was purely academic. Sienna drank her coffee and watched the 2 of them exist in her kitchen and tried to remember the last time her apartment had felt like somewhere people actually lived rather than somewhere she kept her things between work. She couldn't come up with a specific date. That felt like information worth sitting with. After breakfast, while Lily installed herself on Sienna's living room floor with the library book and a seriousness of purpose that Ethan clearly found entirely normal, Sienna refilled both coffee mugs and they stood at the kitchen island and she spread out the documents she'd been working through. Not all of them. She'd photographed the relevant sections and printed them, cleaner, less traceable than pulling them off the company server. She'd been careful. She was always careful, but she'd been a particular kind of careful about this. The kind that meant she was more worried than she was showing. Ethan went through them quietly. He wasn't fast, but he wasn't slow either. He read like someone who was used to following technical documentation, tracking sequences, making sure things added up in the right order. This one, he said after a while, tapping a page. These 2 columns should match. They should. They don't. By how much? Across the past 14 months, about $4.2 million. He looked up. That's not a rounding error, he said. No, it's not. And this is all in Frost's division? The transfers originate there, but they're being routed through 3 or 4 different internal accounts before they go out. Which is why it took me this long to see it. Any single transaction looks like normal operating spend. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. Is he the only one who'd have access? At this level, there are maybe 4 people who could authorize what I'm seeing here. Damien is one of them. 2 of the others have been with the company less than 8 months, which puts them after the pattern starts. The 4th, she stopped. The 4th, Ethan said, is someone I've trusted for a long time. He didn't push. She appreciated that. She wasn't ready to say the name yet. She wasn't sure she'd be ready to say it until she had no choice. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to keep gathering, quietly, until I have enough that there's no way to explain it away. He nodded. He was still looking at the documents, and there was something in his expression she was learning to recognize. the particular quality of attention he gave things that worried him. It wasn't dramatic. It was just very still. "Be careful who you tell," he said. "They know you're looking. I know." "I'm serious, Sienna." It was the first time he'd said her name like that, direct, without any of the careful distance he usually kept around it. She noticed this and said nothing about it. "I know," she said again. "I've been doing this for a long time." "Yeah," he said, "but I don't think you've had to do it from the inside before." She didn't have an answer to that, because he was right. She'd navigated hostile boards, difficult investors, competitors who'd played ugly, but those were external threats. She understood external threats. She'd built walls against them. What she was looking at now was something that had been growing inside the walls, and that was a different thing entirely. Lily, who had apparently finished her chapter and decided she'd been patient long enough, appeared at the kitchen island and announced that she wanted to see the rest of the apartment. Ethan started to say something about that being up to Sienna. "I don't mind," Sienna said. So Lily got the tour. She was methodical about it, opening no drawers or cabinets. She had clearly been briefed on what constituted acceptable curiosity, but looking at everything with a careful thoroughness that reminded Sienna of someone she couldn't quite place until she realized she was reminded of herself. "You don't have very much stuff," Lily said in the third bedroom, which served as a secondary office. "I don't like clutter. My dad doesn't either. He says everything you own is a decision you have to keep making." She tilted her head. "I think that's something he read somewhere." "It sounds like something someone read somewhere," Sienna agreed. "I have a lot of stuff, though, mostly books." Lily moved to the window and looked out. 41st floor. The city spread out in every direction, the downtown skyline catching the late morning light. "Wow." "Yeah," Sienna said. "Do you ever get used to it?" "Honestly, no. I've been here 2 years and it's still—" She stopped, looked at the view. "Still feels a little unreal sometimes." Lily pressed her nose against the glass briefly, which left a small smudge, and Sienna did not say a word about it. "My room has glow-in-the-dark stars," Lily said. "They're not real stars, obviously, but Dad set them up so they're in the right positions, like actually the right positions. He used an app." She turned from the window. "Do you get lonely? In a big apartment by yourself?" Sienna looked at her for a moment. "Sometimes," she said honestly. Lily seemed to take this in. "Dad gets lonely too. He doesn't say so, but I can tell." She said this without pity, just as simple reported fact. "He works a lot and comes home and he's tired, and he tries to make things okay for me, and then after I'm in bed, he just sits. I can hear the TV, but I don't think he's actually watching it." Sienna didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. "I think," Lily said carefully, "that grown-ups are lonely in ways that kids aren't. Like kids can just say, 'I'm lonely. Will you play with me?' But grown-ups don't do that." "No," Sienna said. "They don't." "I think that's dumb," Lily said, with the simple certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to dress her opinions up. Then she walked back out to the living room to retrieve her library book. Sienna stood at the window for another moment. The city sat there in the light, enormous and indifferent, and full of people who were lonely in all the particular ways that adults were lonely. And none of them were saying so. And she thought about an 8-year-old who'd packed her own hot cocoa and brought it to a stranger's house just in case, and she pressed her knuckles briefly against the glass. Then she went back to the kitchen. The following week was the kind of week that reminded Sienna why she'd built the life she had. 3 separate investor calls, a product development crisis that turned into a 36-hour scramble, a meeting with the board's risk committee that she'd come out of feeling like she'd run a full mile at speed. Damien Frost had sat across from her at the risk meeting and been perfectly smooth, perfectly confident, perfectly present, and she'd watched him with the particular kind of attention you gave something you'd decided to take apart, and she'd smiled at him and answered his questions and given him nothing. She was good at giving people nothing when that was what they needed to receive. On Thursday, she got a text from a number she'd saved as E-Cross, Allied. "Lily wanted me to tell you that she finished the library book and you were right about the ending. She says this proves you have good taste." She'd recommended a book. Last Sunday, when Lily had told her what she was reading, and Sienna had happened to know the series, and there had been a brief exchange about whether the third book was worth the wait. She'd said yes. Lily had been unconvinced but willing to reserve judgment. Sienna read the message twice and then typed back, "Tell her the fourth one is even better and she should pace herself." 3 minutes later, she says she doesn't pace herself. Also, she wants to know if you'd come to her school thing next month. There's a science fair. She's doing something with magnets. Sienna put her phone down, picked it up again. "What kind of something with magnets?" The response took a few minutes. She imagined Ethan relaying the question. Then, "She says it's classified until the fair, but she'd like someone there who understands science. I think this is her way of saying my science is not up to standard. Your science got you through an electrical recertification exam. She knows. She still doesn't trust my opinions on scientific methodology. It's a whole thing." Sienna looked at this exchange on her phone screen for a moment. She was sitting in her office on the 34th floor of the Callaway Tower, and it was 7:15 in the evening, and the rest of the floor was mostly empty, and she was smiling at her phone. She noticed this. She noted it the way you noted something unusual. Not alarmed exactly, but paying attention. She could not remember the last time someone texting her had made her smile. Not even a real conversation. Just a text. About a science fair. "I'll be there," she typed. "Tell her to prepare a proper presentation." What? She started asking Ethan for help with the investigation in ways that were easy to justify to herself as practical, because they were practical, and in ways that were harder to justify, because she wanted to talk to him. He was not trained in financial forensics. He was a maintenance contractor. But he had a way of cutting through to the simplest version of a problem and asking the question you were avoiding, and more than once he'd looked at something she'd been analyzing for days and said, "But why would anyone do this in the first place?" in a tone that made her realize she'd been so deep in the how that she'd stopped asking the why. The why mattered. She'd stopped assuming it was purely financial. They met twice in the next 3 weeks. Once at a coffee place near her office, her idea, which she'd framed as a brief catch-up and which they'd both allowed to last almost 2 hours. Once at a park near Lily's school on a Saturday, Lily running some kind of elaborate solo game involving the climbing structure while they sat on a bench and talked, which was the kind of meeting that had no professional justification at all and which neither of them mentioned. "Damien's going to figure out you're watching him," Ethan said on the park bench, not for the first time. "Not yet. You've been pulling records, even quietly, that leaves traces. I've been routing the access through a compliance review, routine audit protocol." She watched a pigeon investigate something near the base of a trash can. "He won't see me. He'll see compliance. Unless compliance reports to him." She was quiet for a moment. 2 of the 3 people who'd get that report have reported to him at some point in the past 5 years. Ethan didn't say, "I told you to be careful." He didn't say anything for a moment. "What's your timeline?" he asked. "I need 4 more weeks of documentation. Maybe 5. If I move before I have the full pattern, he'll claim it was accounting errors, discretionary fund misallocation, something with plausible deniability." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I need it to be airtight. And the merger with Helion? 6 weeks out. So if something moves before then, it would be catastrophic for the merger, for the company's position." She looked at him. "That's probably why the timeline is what it is. Whatever Damien's building toward, the Helion merger is the trigger. Either he's planning to use the merger to move the money in a way that's harder to trace, or he's planning to use the instability of the merger period to make a play for control." Ethan was quiet, looking at the middle distance where Lily had now recruited 2 other children into whatever game she was running, apparently as supporting cast. "She does that everywhere," he said, and his voice had shifted entirely, softer, a little helpless in the way parents sometimes were. "She'll walk into any situation and figure out who wants to be included and make it happen." Sienna followed his gaze. Lily was explaining something with full-body enthusiasm to a kid who was about her age and looked completely captivated. "She gets it from you," Sienna said. He looked at her. "No, she doesn't. I'm not like that. You walked into my boardroom and told me to eat lunch. That's different." "How?" He thought about it. "That was just, she tries to make people feel included. I just say what's actually true and let it land where it lands." And you don't consider that a form of care? He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him turning the question over, examining it. I don't usually think about it that way, he said finally. I know, she said. That's why I said it. He looked at her for a second with an expression that was hard to read. Not closed exactly, but careful, like he was making a decision about something. Then Lily shouted, "Dad, come!" from the climbing structure, and Ethan stood up, and the moment passed. But it didn't disappear. It just went somewhere quieter, somewhere they were both aware of, but hadn't named. Two things happened in the same week. The first was that a junior analyst in Novacore's financial operations team sent Sienna a message through the company's internal system. His name was Priya. No, the message was from someone named Joel Priya, which she initially read wrong. And the message was short, flagged as confidential, and said only, "I think I've found something. I don't know who to tell. I don't know if it's safe to tell anyone. Can we talk?" She'd set a meeting with him for the following morning, private, off the calendar. He was 24. He'd been with Novacore for 11 months. He sat across from her in a conference room she'd booked under a false purpose, and he was visibly nervous in the way of someone who hadn't yet learned how to hide it, which she found more credible than if he'd been composed. He'd found a different part of the same pattern she'd been tracking. He'd found it because he'd made an accounting error of his own, entered a transaction code incorrectly. And when he'd gone to correct it, he'd discovered the corrected version already existed in the system, entered by someone else, with a timestamp from 20 minutes after his original entry. Someone had been monitoring his inputs and correcting them in near real time, not to catch errors, to normalize the data, to make sure anyone reviewing the ledger would see clean numbers. "Do you know who corrected it?" she asked. "The user ID belongs to the compliance review system, but the system runs on automatic protocols and it doesn't fix individual transaction codes. It flags them for human review." He stopped, started again. "Someone used the system's credentials to make the edit look automated. Can you tell me which transactions you were working on when this happened?" He could. He handed her a printout. She looked at it for a moment. It was in Damien Frost's division. Of course it was. "Joel," she said carefully, "I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I need you to continue working exactly as you have been. Don't change anything. Don't flag anything internally. Don't discuss this with anyone in the company." "I'm scared," he said, and he didn't dress it up. "I know. You were right to come to me." She met his eyes. "I'm going to handle this, but I need time, and I need it to stay quiet." He nodded. He didn't look fully reassured. She didn't blame him. The second thing that happened was harder to define. She and Ethan were on the phone. This happened several times a week now, sometimes about the investigation, sometimes not. And she was walking the perimeter of her apartment the way she did when she was working through something. And he was apparently doing the same thing on his end. She could hear the slight change in the quality of the sound that meant he was moving. "Lily asked me about you today," he said. "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were my girlfriend." Sienna stopped walking. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said no." "Right." She said, and I'm repeating this as accurately as I can, she said, "Then why do you talk to her every day?" Sienna said nothing. The city sat beyond her windows, dark now, the lights of 1,000 buildings reflecting off the low cloud cover. "I told her that sometimes people become important to you before you have a name for it," Ethan said. He said it in the same measured way he said most things, which meant she couldn't entirely tell what it was costing him. She held the phone and breathed. "What did she say to that?" She said okay and went back to her book, which either means she accepted the answer or she's decided to let it go for now. With Lily, you can't always tell which one. "She's 8 and terrifying," Sienna said. "She's 8 and correct," he said quietly. There was a silence that was the kind she was getting used to. Not awkward, but full. The kind that meant something was in it. "Ethan," she said. "Don't," he said, not sharp, careful. "Not yet. I'm not. There are things I'm still working out." She understood what he meant. Not just "I'm cautious," not just "this is complicated." but something about what it meant to let someone into a life that was already full of risk, already stripped to essentials, already organized around protecting the one thing that mattered most to him. She was not a small variable to introduce. She was also, she knew this, had thought about it, not an easy person to be close to. She was difficult and demanding, and entirely too good at keeping people exactly as close as she wanted them and no closer. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They stayed on the line for another 20 minutes without resolving anything, talking about Lily's magnet project and a problem Ethan had run into on a job in a documentary she'd watched the previous night about deep-sea fish. They talked like people who had become, without particularly planning it, necessary to each other. And then they said goodnight, and she sat in her apartment in the dark for a while and thought about how strange it was that the most uncomplicated she'd felt in years was in the middle of what might be the most complicated situation she'd ever been in. The invitation came on a Friday. Gold-embossed card, physically mailed, hand-addressed. A charity gala organized by 4 of the city's major financial institutions. The kind of event where attendance was less about the charity than about who you were seen talking to in the atrium. The name on the invitation was hers. The handwritten note at the bottom was from Richard Calloway, owner of the building her company occupied, board member of 2 of the institutions co-hosting the event, and one of the oldest and most quietly powerful people in the city's business landscape. He wanted her there. She went. She wore the black dress she kept for this category of event, and she moved through the room the way she always did at these things. Precise, present, reading the currents. She could tell within about 40 minutes that something was different. People were talking to her normally on the surface, but underneath, there was something that felt like people measuring the distance between themselves and her, a subtle recalibration. She found out why when Richard Calloway himself appeared at her elbow near the bar, genial as ever, and said in a voice designed to sound like casual conversation, "I heard Helion's been asking questions, Sienna, not publicly, but asking." "What kind of questions?" "About stability, about leadership continuity." He swirled his drink. "About whether the current structure at Novacor will be the same structure in 6 months." She kept her face very still. "And who's giving them answers?" He looked at her. He was 71 years old and had survived 4 economic downturns and 2 serious scandals, neither of which had ever been publicly connected to him, and he looked at her the way someone looked at you when they respected you enough to be direct. "Someone inside your organization," he said. "Someone who's been positioning himself for about a year, as far as I can tell. Someone who'd benefit significantly from a failed merger and a destabilized board." She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough to send you this invitation." He raised his glass slightly. "The question is whether you've got enough to move on." "Not yet," she said. "How much time do you need?" She looked across the room at the assembled financial power of the city, people who could help her or hurt her, or simply watch from a comfortable distance. And she thought about Joel Priya sitting across from her looking scared. She thought about $4.2 million moving through internal accounts in pieces small enough to look like nothing. 3 weeks, she said. "You've got 2, Richard Calloway said. "After that, I can't promise the conversation stays quiet." She nodded. She had her second glass of wine of the evening, and she smiled at the people who smiled at her, and she made the rounds with the precision of someone running out of time who intended to make every minute count. In the car home, she called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to move faster," she said. "Tell me you've been thinking about this." "I have been thinking about this," he said. She let out a breath. "Good." A pause. "How are you?" "Tired," he said. "Long week. Lily's got a cold. She's been up a few nights." "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She's annoyed. She considers being sick a waste of her time." A beat. "She keeps asking when you're coming over again." Sienna closed her eyes briefly in the back of the car. "Soon," she said. "Tell her soon." "I will." He paused. "Be careful at those things. Those rooms are full of people who are good at looking like allies." "I know." "You doing okay?" She thought about the answer. The real one, not the version she'd have given anyone else. "I'm okay," she said. Better, actually, now that I called. The silence on the other end had the particular quality of someone deciding something. Lily's asleep, he said quietly. I've got time. Tell me everything from tonight. She told him. And the city moved past the car windows, and she kept talking. And somewhere across town, in a small apartment with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, a man listened carefully and asked exactly the right questions. And she was not alone in the middle of the thing that was coming for her, and that mattered more than she'd known how to let it matter until now. She was 11 days from having enough. Sienna knew this because she'd been counting, not obsessively, but the way you counted when the margin between enough and not enough was the difference between winning and losing everything. 11 days of clean documentation filed in a system she'd set up outside of Novacore's server architecture, on a personal encrypted drive that lived in her apartment and nowhere else. 11 more days, and she'd have 14 months of complete financial records showing a clear, unambiguous pattern of internal fraud, investor manipulation, and what her outside attorney, the only person she'd brought in, quietly, billed through a personal account, had called, in the measured language of someone who understood the weight of words, a textbook case of fiduciary betrayal. 11 days. She didn't get them. So it started on a Tuesday evening, which was so ordinary a beginning for something catastrophic that she almost didn't recognize it for what it was. She was at the office late, later than usual, which was saying something, reviewing the Helion merger final terms with her legal team. The meeting had run long. They were in the last stretch of due diligence, and Helion's attorneys had sent over a revision to the governance structure that Sienna wanted to look at carefully before she agreed to anything. She'd sent her team home at 9 and stayed herself, because some things you had to read in quiet, without anyone else in the room giving you their version of what the words meant. Her phone buzzed at 9:47. It was a news alert. Financial Desk, one of the major outlets. The headline read, Novacore Technologies CEO Sienna Vale under internal investigation for financial misconduct. Sources. She read it once, then again. Then she put the phone face down on the desk and sat very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she picked it up and called her attorney. I've seen it, he said before she could speak. His name was David Hart. He was 63, and he had the particular calm of someone who had survived enough disasters to know that panic was the first thing you had to get rid of. It went out at 9:40. 3 outlets have picked it up already. Where did it come from? Anonymous sources within the company. That's all they're citing. It's Damien. Almost certainly. He's accelerating. Something spooked him. She thought about Joel Priya, about the quiet audit trail she'd been building, about the fact that someone had been monitoring internal financial entries in near real time. He knew I was looking, she said. Possibly. Or the Helion timeline moved faster than he expected, and he needed to act before you did. A pause. Sienna, your board is going to call an emergency session. I know. Tonight, probably. I know. She was already standing, already moving to the window. The city below was indifferent, lit up in all its ordinary nighttime business. What's my position? Your position is that you have nothing to hide and you welcome any review of your financial conduct. He said it steadily. But you have to be in that room. If you're not in that room, the absence speaks for itself. She called Monica next. Monica answered on the second ring, which told Sienna she'd also seen the news. Get me the board contact list, Sienna said. All of them, personal numbers. I need to make 6 calls in the next 20 minutes. Already on your screen, Monica said. I sent it 2 minutes ago. Thank you. A beat. Go home, Monica. I'm staying. Monica. I'm staying, Monica said with a firmness that was unusual enough that Sienna didn't push it. She made the calls. 4 of the 6 board members answered. 2 didn't. One of whom was a name she'd half expected. The other surprised her enough that she had to stop for a moment after she hung up and revise a mental calculation she'd thought was settled. She kept her voice level through all 4 conversations, gave them the same message in 4 slightly different registers. This is a fabrication. I have documentation that will make that clear. I need 48 hours. And she watched their voices for what wasn't being said. 2 of them gave her 48 hours. One of them said he'd need to consult with other board members first. The 4th said, gently and with the particular kindness of someone delivering news they found unpleasant. Sienna, the emergency session is already scheduled, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She thanked him and hung up. She sat at her desk in the empty office on the 34th floor and looked at the Helion merger documents still spread across the table, and she understood, with the specific, terrible clarity of someone watching something they built start to come apart at the seams, that she was not going to make it to 11 days. She was not sure she was going to make it to tomorrow morning. She called Ethan at 10:20. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to call her attorney back, then go through the board member list again, and figure out who she could still reach tonight, then start preparing the documentation she'd need for tomorrow's session. She had a plan. The plan was what you held on to when everything else was moving, but her hands made the call before her plan did, and that was the thing she noted about herself, quietly, without judgment, as the phone rang. He picked up on the third ring. "I saw," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad?" She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. "Emergency board session at 8 tomorrow. 3 outlets running the story. Helion will see it by morning. Their attorneys will have questions by noon. What do you need right now?" She looked at the city through the window. 41st floor, all those lights. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said all evening and the hardest. "Okay." A pause. She heard a sound on his end. A chair. He was sitting down. "Walk me through what happened. Start from when you got the alert." So she did. She told him everything. The board calls, David Hart, the 2 board members who hadn't answered, the revised calculation she'd had to make about who was where. She wasn't looking for solutions. She just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell her what she wanted to hear. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He didn't offer anything that wasn't useful. When she finished, he said, "Your documentation, the encrypted drive, it's safe? It's at home. Good. That's still yours. That doesn't go away. It's not enough yet. I needed 11 more days. Is there any way to compress that?" She thought about it. "If I file the financial misconduct report with the board myself preemptively, tonight, it reframes who's the aggressor, but I'd be moving before I have the full pattern. He could claim the gaps are his evidence." "What does your attorney say?" "I haven't asked him that yet." "Call him back. Right now. I'll be here." She did. She had a 40-minute conversation with David Hart that she stood through the entire time, pacing the perimeter of her office, and by the end of it, they'd agreed on a strategy that was not the strategy she'd wanted, but was the strategy she had. She would walk into the board session tomorrow morning with everything she had, not everything she'd wanted, but everything she had, and she would present it herself, clearly, before Damien had a chance to set the frame. It was a risk. Every option was a risk now. The question was which risk you chose. She called Ethan back. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "How are you doing?" She stopped. She sat down in her chair. She looked at her hands on the desk. They were steady. They'd been steady all evening, which she found exhausting in a way that was hard to explain. Maintaining steady was its own kind of work. "I'm scared," she said. She said it the same way Joel Priya had said it to her across a conference table, without dressing it up. Because she was talking to Ethan, and he'd never made her feel like she needed to dress things up. "I know," he said. "I built this company, not from nothing. I know it wasn't from nothing. I had investors and a board and a team. But I built what it is. The strategy, the direction, the culture. 400 people who came to work every day because they believed we were doing something worth doing." She looked at the wall. "And now my name is in a headline as a fraud." "Your name is in a headline as someone accused of fraud," he said. "That's different. Not to the people reading it at 10 o'clock at night." "No," he admitted. "Not tonight. But it will be," she breathed. "You don't know that." "No," he said again. "But I know you, and you're not going to let this just happen to you." She was quiet for a moment. "Ethan?" "Yeah." "Go be with Lily." "She's asleep." "I know. Go be in the same place as her." She said it carefully. "It'll help. Not me. You. Just go be near her. A pause. You sure? I'm sure. She stood up, put her blazer back on, gathered the Helion documents into a folder even though she didn't know if they'd ever be relevant again. I have work to do, and you've already done more than you know. He didn't push. He understood when something was decided. Call me after the board session, he said. Doesn't matter what time. Okay. Sienna. Yeah. You built something real that doesn't disappear because someone told a story about it. She held the phone for a moment after he said it. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night. The board session lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Sienna knew the exact duration because she'd watched the clock on the wall of the conference room. The same conference room where her board had sat 3 months earlier and approved the Helion merger terms. And she'd tracked every minute the way you tracked something you were surviving. She presented her documentation first. She'd requested, through David Hart, the right to address the board before any formal proceedings, and they'd granted it, which she took as a sign that at least some of them were still thinking clearly. She stood at the head of the table where she'd stood dozens of times before, and she laid out 14 months of financial irregularities. The account routing Joel Priya's testimony, which he'd agreed to give in writing at considerable personal risk to himself, and she intended to remember that, and the pattern of systematic manipulation that pointed clearly and specifically to Damien Frost. Damien sat at the table 3 seats to her left. He let her finish. He did not interrupt, did not react visibly, sat with the particular stillness of someone who had prepared for this moment more thoroughly than she'd known. When she finished, he placed a folder on the table and said, in the reasonable tone of someone presenting a counter-argument, I appreciate Sienna's commitment to transparency, which is exactly why I think it's time for the board to review her own financial conduct. The folder contained 47 pages of documents. She'd seen them before. Not these exact documents, but their shape. Financial transfers selectively presented, decisions she'd made over 2 years stripped of context and reframed. A compensation package she'd approved for a departing executive presented as inappropriate personal expenditure. A consulting retainer she'd authorized, reframed as a kickback. Small things, individually dismissible. Together, in the hands of someone who'd had a year to arrange them, arranged to look like something they weren't. He'd had a year. She'd had 11 days that became 0. The board session became a process. Questions, responses, documentation requests, counter-arguments. She answered everything. She did not lose her composure. She caught 2 factual errors in Damien's documents and named them clearly, with sources, which landed the way factual corrections landed when everyone in the room was watching. Noted, but not dispositive. Not enough on its own. At the end of 4 hours and 11 minutes, the board chair, a man named Gerald Cho, 67, who had been on the board since the company's founding and who Sienna had always found fair if deeply cautious, said that given the seriousness of the allegations on both sides, the board was suspending active executive decision-making authority pending a full independent review. Suspending active executive decision-making authority, which meant, in plain language, that she was still CEO in title and not in practice, which meant Damien had won the first round. The building felt different when she walked out of the conference room. She knew this was partly her, perception colored by what had just happened, but partly it was real. People in the hallway moved differently around her. Not all of them. A few people caught her eye and held it, which meant they were still there. But the shift was visible, the way a change in air pressure was visible in how people stood and breathed and chose not to say certain things. Marcus, the VP of communications who'd been on the intercom that first day, was waiting for her outside the conference room. He fell into step beside her without asking. I heard, he said quietly. I know. What do you need? She thought about it. I need Helion to not do anything stupid in the next 24 hours. I can call their communications lead. We went to school together. Do it. She paused. Don't say more than you have to. Just buy time. He nodded. He peeled off toward his office. She went to hers, closed the door, and sat at her desk. Her inbox had 43 new messages. She looked at the names on the first 3 and closed the laptop. She called David Hart. He told her that the independent review would take 4 to 6 weeks, that the board had made the legally defensible move in the circumstances, and that their case was not lost. He said this in the calm, measured way of someone who meant it as professional assessment and not comfort, which was what she needed from him. She called Monica next. Monica said, "Your calendar's cleared for the rest of the week. I told everyone the board session ran long. I said nothing else." A pause. "That's all I could do today. I'll come up with more tomorrow." "Thank you, Monica." "Please go home," Monica said. "You've been here since before 7 this morning." She went home. She was sitting in her apartment at 3 in the afternoon, still in the blazer she'd worn to the board session, when someone knocked on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't called anyone. She'd called her mother briefly, a 10-minute conversation that had been the most exhausting 10 minutes of the day because her mother had tried to help, and help from her mother sounded like worry piled on worry, and Sienna had been gentle and patient about it, and afterward felt hollowed out. She opened the door. Ethan was standing in the hallway. Lily was beside him, slightly behind, holding a piece of paper rolled up in both hands like a scroll. She was also wearing her school backpack, which suggested they'd come directly from pickup. Sienna looked at them for a moment. "I didn't call you," she said. Not accusing, just noting. "I know," Ethan said. "We were in the neighborhood." "You live 20 minutes from here." "Lily had a thing near here." "Dad, we didn't have a—" "Lily." Ethan's voice was gentle but definitive. Lily closed her mouth. She looked at Sienna. Something in her face, which was usually running at full speed in all directions, was quieter than usual, more careful. She held out the rolled-up paper. Sienna took it and unrolled it. It was a drawing. Crayon, the precise and slightly effortful kind that meant she'd taken her time. 3 figures standing side by side in front of what appeared to be a building, a tall one with many windows. The 3 figures were clearly meant to be specific people. A tall one in a blazer, a slightly shorter one with a toolbox, and a small one between them with curly hair. All 3 were holding hands. Under the drawing, in the careful print of a child who had recently learned that handwriting mattered, it said, "We are your people." Sienna stood in her doorway and looked at the drawing for a long moment. "She insisted on bringing it today," Ethan said quietly. "She wouldn't tell me why she picked today until we were in the car." "I saw the news this morning," Lily said, with the directness of someone who hadn't learned yet to talk around hard things. "My teacher was talking about it before class. She didn't know I knew you." She paused. "I didn't like how she said it." Sienna looked at her. "How did she say it?" "Like it was decided. Like you already lost." Lily was serious in the way children were serious when they'd thought about something carefully. "I don't think that's true." Sienna didn't say anything for a beat. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Bachap. Ethan made tea. This was, she noticed, something he defaulted to. The practical action, the thing that gave the room something to organize around. He found the kettle, found the tea, found the mugs, and moved through her kitchen with the easy competence of someone who'd been there enough times to know where things were. Which was true. He had been there enough times. Lily was at the kitchen island, doing homework she'd taken from her backpack, asking Sienna questions about math every few minutes with no apparent awareness that this was an unusual thing to do. Sienna answered when she could and said, "Ask your dad," when she couldn't, and the rhythm of it was strange and ordinary, and she found she was grateful for both qualities. "The board suspended my authority," she said when Lily was deep enough into a worksheet to be temporarily unavailable. Ethan looked at her over the rim of his mug. "Temporarily," she said. "Independent review, 4 to 6 weeks. Is the documentation enough?" "To clear me, yes." "I think so. My attorney thinks so." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "But clearing me and winning are different things. Damien's already talking to investors. I've heard through 3 separate people that he's been making calls for the past 48 hours. He's building a coalition." "Can he take the company?" She was quiet for a moment. "If he gets 3 more board members to flip, he can call a shareholder vote. If he controls enough shares through the investors he's already courted." She stopped. "It's possible." It's more possible than I want to say out loud. Ethan set his mug down. What would that look like? He'd restructure the leadership, install himself as CEO. The merger with Helion either collapses or gets renegotiated on terms that benefit the new structure. The 400 people who work at Novacor, she stopped again, looked at the countertop. Some of them would be fine. Some of them wouldn't. Damien has a list of people he considers loyal and a list of people he considers obstacles, and he is not subtle about which is which. She thought about Marcus, about Joel Priya, who'd taken a risk she'd asked him to take and was now sitting somewhere not knowing how it had landed, about Monica, who'd stayed. I'm not done, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not saying this because I'm giving up. I know you're not, Ethan said, but I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I wanted to... She paused. She looked at him directly. I wanted to tell you that whatever happens, you and Lily should not be part of the collateral. If there's fallout, if people start looking at who I spend time with... Stop, he said. Ethan, stop. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. I'm not a variable you can solve for. I'm not something you get to remove from the equation because you think it's cleaner. I'm trying to protect you. I know what you're doing. He looked at her steadily. And I appreciate it, and I'm telling you no. You have Lily to think about. I'm always thinking about Lily. That doesn't mean I disappear when things get hard. He was quiet for a second. That's not the kind of person I am, and I don't think you actually want me to be. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. Sienna. He said it the way he'd said it on the phone that night, direct, without the careful distance. You're not going to face this alone. That's not something I'm offering you the choice about. Lily looked up from her worksheet. She'd clearly been listening. She said nothing, just looked at them both, then looked back down. But she was almost smiling, and she was not good at hiding it. Sienna looked at the drawing on the counter. 3 figures, all holding hands. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not break, not collapse, just loosen. Like something that had been held very tight for a very long time was remembering that it didn't have to be. Thank you, she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. Ethan picked up his mug again. Don't thank me, he said. Just show me what you have left on that encrypted drive. So she did. 2 days later, Damien called an emergency investor conference call. She found out from Richard Calloway, who was on the call's invite list and who messaged her afterward with 3 sentences and no punctuation, which was how he communicated when things were moving fast. He's positioning for a governance vote, has 9 investors committed as of this morning, needs 3 more board members. She had 2 board members she was certain of. 3 she believed were uncertain. 1 who had not returned her calls since the headlines broke. The math was not comfortable. She spent 3 days in meetings she hadn't scheduled, and phone calls that went past midnight, and conversations that required her to hold her position with exactly the right amount of force. Enough to be credible, not so much that she looked desperate. She slept 4 hours the first night and 5 the second, and on the third night she didn't sleep at all, just sat at her kitchen island with the encrypted drive and her laptop, and went through everything again, looking for what she might have missed. She found it at 4 in the morning. It was small. A single account number that appeared in the transfer chain, repeated 6 times across 14 months, that she had traced previously to a shell company registered in Delaware. She'd hit a wall with the shell company 3 weeks earlier because the beneficial ownership was obscured behind 2 additional corporate layers. At 4 in the morning, running on no sleep and the 3rd cup of terrible coffee she'd made from the bag at the back of her cabinet, she ran the account number against a different database, not the one she'd been using. A public records database she'd pulled up on an instinct that was maybe half desperation. The account had received a wire transfer 3 years earlier from a company she recognized, not Novacor, a construction firm she'd looked into during Novacor's initial facility build-out and declined to use because of questions about their compliance record. That construction firm had, at the time she'd looked into them, one primary investor of record, Damien Frost. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she called David Hart at 4:17 in the morning. He answered, which told her he'd been awake too. I found the direct link, she said. The money isn't going to an outside third party. It's going back to him. He's been paying himself through a chain of entities he controls. A silence on the other end. Then, can you prove the beneficial ownership? I can show the connection. An attorney with subpoena power could prove the rest. Sienna, he took a breath. This changes things. If we can get this in front of the right people before the governance vote, how fast can you move? I'd need to make some calls, regulatory contacts, not quick officially, but there are ways to... He stopped. Give me until morning. It is morning. Give me until actual morning, he said, and she could hear the exhaustion and the focus in equal measure. And let me work. She put the phone down. She sat in her kitchen in the 4 a.m. quiet, and she was not yet safe, and she was not yet winning, but she had something she hadn't had before, and that mattered. That was real. She texted Ethan even though she knew he was asleep. I found it. His response came 40 seconds later, which meant he hadn't been asleep at all. Tell me. She called him. She told him. He listened. And then he said in the quiet voice of someone who was relieved in a way he wasn't going to overstate, Okay, now what? Now, she said. We see if it's enough. Outside her windows, the city was still dark. That particular pre-dawn dark that was different from the nighttime dark. Emptier, stiller, the whole thing on the edge of something. She sat with the encrypted drive in her hands and the phone at her ear, and she held on to both. She had not won. She was a long way from winning, but she had found the thread, and she was not letting go of it. David Hart moved fast, faster than Sienna had expected, which said something because she'd hired him specifically because he moved fast. By 7 in the morning, he'd reached 2 contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. Not through official channels, not yet, but through the particular network of relationships that existed between people who'd spent careers in financial law and knew when something was worth picking up the phone at 7 in the morning for. By 9, he had a preliminary conversation documented. By 11, he called Sienna and told her in his measured way that the regulatory interest was real and that the timeline for official action was likely to be measured in days rather than weeks. How many days, she asked. 3 to 5 if they move quickly. They'll want to freeze the relevant accounts before Damien can move money. That's their first priority. And the governance vote is scheduled for Friday, which gives us 2 days, she said. 2 days, he confirmed. If the SEC moves before Friday, the vote becomes procedurally complicated. A company can't vote on leadership restructuring while it's under active regulatory review, not without significant legal exposure for every board member who participates. She was quiet for a moment. He'll know something is happening. Probably. He has people watching the same channels we do. Then he'll try to accelerate. Yes, David said. He will. She thanked him and hung up and stood at her kitchen window for a moment, thinking about what it meant to be in a race where the other person also knew they were racing. Then she called Ethan. He was on a job. She could hear the particular background ambient of a commercial space, the distant hum of HVAC, the occasional sound of something being moved. He stepped away to talk, and she could tell from the change in the sound that he'd gone somewhere quieter. She gave him the update. Concise, the way she'd learned to be with him because he processed information better when it wasn't padded. 2 days, he said. 2 days. What do you need from me? She thought about this honestly. Nothing operational. David's handling the regulatory piece. My attorney team is preparing documentation. She paused. I wanted you to know where things are. Okay? A beat. How are you holding up? I haven't slept. I know. How are you holding up? She looked at the window. The city was doing its ordinary morning thing, buses and pedestrians, and the particular mid-morning light of a November weekday, completely indifferent to whatever was happening on the 41st floor of a residential building a few blocks over. I'm scared, she said, for the second time in as many days. It was getting slightly easier to say. She wasn't sure if that was good or not. I'm scared that 2 days isn't enough. I'm scared that even if the SEC moves, Damien has enough momentum with the investors that the vote happens anyway. I'm scared that 400 people lose their jobs because I didn't see this coming fast enough. He didn't tell her she'd done everything right. He didn't tell her it would work out. She appreciated this because she would have known both things were only partially true. "What's the one thing you can do today that matters most?" he asked. She thought about it. "The 3 uncertain board members. I need to talk to them before Damien does." "Then do that." "I've been putting it off because I don't know what I'm walking into." "I know," he said. "Do it anyway." She called Monica. "I need face-to-face meetings with Patricia Ewan, Howard Lim, and Stephen Garrett. Today. I don't care where or when. I'll go to them." "Patricia Ewan is in Boston until tomorrow," Monica said. "Book me on the noon flight." "That's in 2 hours." "I know." She met Patricia Ewan in a conference room at a law firm in downtown Boston at 3 in the afternoon. Patricia was 61, a former federal appellate judge who had moved into corporate governance 15 years earlier, and she was one of the board members who had not returned Sienna's calls after the initial headlines. Sienna had expected cold. What she got was careful, which was different, more workable. "I haven't called you back," Patricia said before Sienna could open, "because I wanted to hear both sides before I spoke to either of you." "And have you heard Damien's side?" "Yesterday morning, for 90 minutes. She looked at Sienna steadily. "He's thorough. I'll give him that. He's had a year to prepare. He has documentation. So do I." Sienna placed a folder on the table. "Mine shows a different story than his." Patricia took the folder. She read it, not skimmed, actually read, while Sienna sat across from her and did not fidget. 14 minutes. Sienna counted. When Patricia looked up, her expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but something in it was different. "This account change," she said, tapping a page. "You've traced this to him directly?" "Through a company he invested in 3 years ago. The beneficial ownership requires subpoena power to fully establish, but the connection is documentable." "And the SEC?" Sienna paused, then decided. "There's been preliminary contact. I expect formal action within 3 to 5 days. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "You're telling me this because you trust me. I'm telling you this because you're someone who makes decisions based on what's actually true, and I need you to have the full picture." Sienna met her eyes. "I also need you to understand that if the governance vote happens Friday and the SEC moves Saturday, every board member who voted will have a very uncomfortable few months." This was a pressure point. She wasn't proud of it, but she used it because it was real, and Patricia Ewan had spent a career in law and knew the difference between a threat and a fact. "I need 24 hours, Patricia said. "You have them." Sienna took the 7 o'clock flight back and landed at 9:45, and had a car waiting and went directly to Howard Lim's house in the Westfield suburb because he'd agreed to a 10:30 meeting and she was not going to be late. Howard was 70, retired tech executive, had known the company's founder personally, and had a complicated relationship with the idea of Sienna as CEO that he'd never been entirely transparent about, but which she'd always been aware of. The conversation lasted an hour and was the hardest one she had that week. Howard asked questions that were pointed in the way of someone who wasn't fully committed but was paying attention. She answered them. Some of the answers she gave were not the ones he wanted, and she gave them anyway because the truth was the only asset she had that Damien couldn't duplicate. At the end, Howard said, "I need to think." "I know," she said. "Think fast." She got home at midnight. She ate half a bowl of soup she found in her fridge from 2 days earlier and reheated without really tasting it. She called David Hart for an update. Nothing yet from the SEC, but the indications were still positive. She texted Ethan a single line. 2 down. Stephen Garrett tomorrow. Going to sleep now. His response? Good. Sleep. She slept for 5 hours, which was more than she'd gotten in 3 days, and woke up feeling not rested but functional, which was enough. Stephen Garrett was 48, the youngest board member, a venture capitalist who had made his money early and spent the decade since doing a very good impression of someone relaxed about everything. Sienna had always found him the most difficult to read, which made him the most dangerous variable. He met her at a coffee place near his office. His choice of venue, which meant he wanted this to feel casual, which meant he'd already decided something and was managing how she received it. She ordered coffee she didn't need and waited. "I talked to Damien this morning," he said, which was how he opened. "I assumed you had. He made a compelling case. He usually does." Stephen looked at his cup. He's offering a significant restructuring package. New leadership team, revised investor terms, a merger approach to Helion that he says is more favorable. He looked up. It's not a bad deal, Sienna. From a pure numbers perspective. From a pure numbers perspective, she said evenly. So was every deal he put together using money he was systematically stealing from the company. A beat. The SEC contact is real? He asked. She looked at him. Where did you hear that? Damien mentioned he'd heard something. She felt something cold move through her. If Damien knew about the SEC contact, he had someone inside the regulatory channel, or inside David Hart's network. Either way, his information was better than she'd thought. It's real, she said, and if you vote with him Friday, you'll be on the wrong side of it. Stephen looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of someone who was weighing two futures and finding both of them uncomfortable. I want to be honest with you, he said. I've never been fully convinced you were the right person for this role. I was skeptical when the board chose you. I've updated that view over 2 years. You've done things I didn't expect. But I'm not in your corner by default. I know, she said. What I am, he said, is committed to the company not being run by someone who's been stealing from it. He picked up his cup. Get me the documentation, the full chain, by tomorrow morning. You'll have it by tonight. He nodded. That was it. No warmth, no reassurance. Just a decision made on terms she could respect even when they were uncomfortable. She sent the documentation to his secure email before she was back in the car. The SEC moved on Thursday morning. Account freezes, formal investigation notice, and a preliminary injunction that prevented any significant financial restructuring at Novacor pending the investigation. David Hart called her at 8:15 with the news, and his voice had the particular quality of someone who had been doing this a long time and still found moments like this worth feeling. It's not over, he said immediately. This is one step. I know. Damien will fight it. He has resources and he has lawyers, and he's not going to accept this quietly. I know. But Friday's vote is effectively dead, she said. Procedurally, yes. She sat with this for a moment. She'd spent 2 years building a company. She'd spent the last month watching someone try to take it. She'd barely slept in a week. And now, in an 8:15 phone call on a Thursday morning, the immediate crisis had shifted. Not resolved, not finished, but shifted. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that went down to her bones. What happens now? She asked. Investigation runs its course. Weeks, possibly months. Your suspension is almost certainly lifted by the board within the next few days, but they have no legal basis to maintain it once the regulatory picture is clear. The merger with Helion. He paused. That's going to need work, but it's not dead. Damien. That's for the courts, but Sienna. He stopped. She could hear him choosing words. The account chain you found at 4 a.m, that's the core of the case. Everything else is supporting material. That was the thing that made this work. She thought about sitting at her kitchen island with bad coffee and an encrypted drive and the particular desperate focus of someone who had run out of options except the one in front of her. Thank you, David, she said, for answering the phone at 4 a.m. You pay me well, he said, but she could hear the almost smile underneath it. She called Ethan from the car. He picked up on the first ring. She could hear that he was outside. Wind, street sounds, the specific quality of daylight in audio. It moved, she said. A silence. Then, tell me. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted a few seconds longer than usual. Okay, he said finally. His voice was quiet. Okay. It's not done, she said. I want to be clear about that. It's not done. I know, but you're still standing. She looked out the car window at the city going past. Yeah, she said. Still standing. How do you feel? She thought about how to answer this honestly. Like, I want to sleep for 3 days. Like, I need to call the entire company, and I don't know what to say yet. Like, she stopped. Like, the thing I want most right now is to sit in your kitchen and not talk about any of this for approximately 2 hours. A beat. I don't have much of a kitchen, he said. I know. That's why I said yours. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, something quieter. Lily's at school until 3. I know what time school ends. Sienna, Ethan, I'm not asking for anything. She stopped, started again. I've been alone in this for a long time. Even with David and Monica and Marcus and everyone who helped, I've been doing this fundamentally alone, and I'm tired of that. She said it without drama, just straight. I'd like to sit in your kitchen and drink bad coffee and not perform anything for a couple of hours. That's all I'm asking. The silence on his end was the particular kind that meant he was letting something settle, not stalling. I'll be home by noon, he said. The coffee's not that bad. Lily said you buy the grocery store brand. The grocery store brand is fine. The grocery store brand is not fine, Ethan. Come over and tell me that to my face, he said, and this time it was definitely a laugh, low and real, and she held the phone a second longer than she needed to just to keep it close. His apartment was smaller than she'd imagined and exactly what she'd expected, both things at once. She'd been to his building twice before, once to drop something off, once when she'd had a meeting nearby and they'd talked in the parking area, but she hadn't been inside. He'd been careful about that, about the particular intimacy of someone else in the space where he and Lily lived, and she'd understood it and hadn't pushed. He held the door open and she walked in and looked around. It was clean, which didn't surprise her. Small, 2 rooms plus the converted closet that Lily had told her about. The walls carrying the evidence of a child who'd grown up here. Drawings taped at various heights. A height chart penciled on the inside of a door frame. A small shelf of trophies and ribbons that looked like they were from school events. The main room served as living room and kitchen combined. A fold-out table against one wall with Lily's homework spread on it. A couch that was clearly old but not worn out. A TV that was not large. There was a photograph on a shelf near the window. A woman she'd never seen smiling at the camera with the ease of someone who didn't notice they were being photographed. Lily's eyes. Lily's smile. Sienna looked at it for a moment and then looked away, and Ethan said nothing, and neither did she. He made coffee. She sat at the small kitchen table and did not look at her phone for 37 minutes, which was the longest she'd gone without checking it in about 2 weeks. She was aware of this. She let it be. They talked about Lily's science fair, which was in 2 weeks, and which Lily had been intensifying her preparation for with a seriousness of purpose that Ethan described as both admirable and mildly alarming. They talked about a job he'd done the previous week, an old apartment building in the Northfield district, original wiring from the 70s, the kind of electrical situation that made him go home and check their own apartment afterward. She told him about a documentary she'd watched at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, about deep-sea bioluminescence, because her brain had needed something that had nothing to do with corporate governance. He told her that Lily had asked 3 days ago whether Sienna was okay. Sienna looked up from her coffee. She asked that? She saw something on the news. She didn't say anything for a while. She just went quiet for a couple of hours, which is unusual for her. Then at dinner, she asked if you had people taking care of you. Sienna was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said I thought so. He looked at her. I told her you were one of the strongest people I know. She said that wasn't the question. Sienna set her mug down. She's right, she said. That wasn't the question. No, he agreed. The afternoon light was moving across the kitchen floor at the angle of November, low and sideways, and a little gold. It landed on the table between them and on the grocery store brand coffee that was, in fact, fine, and on his hands where they rested near his mug, the scarred knuckles and the slightly crooked finger, and the particular steadiness of someone who had held things together through worse than this for longer than most people would manage. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He didn't move. He looked at their hands for a moment, then at her. You don't have to figure this out right now, she said. I know you're still working out whatever you're working out. I'm not asking you to have it figured out. He turned his hand over under hers, not pulling away, the opposite, just shifting so they were palm to palm. I know what I'm working out, he said quietly. Then what is it? He looked at her with the expression she'd seen that first day in the electrical room, the one without performance, without calculation, just entirely present. I know what this is, he said. I've known for a while. He stopped. I haven't let myself have things I wanted in a long time. It takes a minute to remember how. She didn't say anything. She let the sentence land and stay where it was. Okay, she said, finally. Just that. He nodded. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand, and she felt it the way you felt small things that were actually large things. They were still sitting like that when Lily's key turned in the lock at 3:15, and she came through the door, dropping her backpack with the practiced efficiency of someone who came home the same way every day, and looked up and saw them, and said absolutely nothing, just went to the refrigerator and got herself a juice box with the serene expression of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed and who was too polite to say so. Ethan looked at his daughter. How was school? Good, Lily said. She looked at Sienna. Are you staying for dinner? Sienna looked at Ethan. I'm making pasta, he said. It was not an invitation exactly. It was just information, delivered without pressure, the way he delivered most things. Yeah, Sienna said. I'm staying. The board reinstated her authority on a Monday. Not unanimously. Nothing was ever unanimous. But the vote was 6-2, and the two who voted against were the two she'd already known about, and that was that. Gerald Cho called her personally before the formal notification and said, in the careful language of a man who chose his words, "We should have moved faster to give you the chance to address this directly." She accepted this without making him say more. He was right, and he knew she knew he was right, and they both understood that some things didn't need to be drawn out. She walked back into her office on a Tuesday morning. Monica had left a cup of coffee on her desk, not the grocery store brand, and a single sticky note that said, "Welcome back," in Monica's small, precise handwriting. She sat down and looked at the city through the window, the same view she'd had for 2 years, and it looked the same and felt different, the way places felt different after something happened in them. Marcus appeared in her doorway. Ready? Give me 10 minutes. You have 12 messages from Helion's legal team. I know. Give me 10 minutes first. He gave her 10 minutes. She spent them at her window with her coffee, not thinking about strategy or next steps or the investigation or the merger. She spent them thinking about a kitchen table in November light, about a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, about a man who said, "I haven't let myself have things I wanted," in a tone that treated it as a simple, true statement rather than something that needed sympathy. About what it meant to rebuild something, and what you kept from the version that had broken, and what you left behind. Then she set the cup down and turned around and got to work. The startup idea came from a conversation she hadn't expected. She was still at Novacor. The investigation was ongoing, the company was stable but bruised, and the Helion merger was in a holding pattern that her legal team described as cautiously alive. She was doing the work of putting things back together, which was harder in some ways than the work of building them had been, because you had to decide piece by piece what was worth keeping. Joel Priya came to her office 3 weeks after everything broke. He knocked, stood in the doorway, said, "I wanted to know what's next. For the investigation? For the company?" He paused. "And for me. I've been thinking about leaving, not because of what happened, because I've been thinking about it for a while. I had an idea I couldn't develop here." He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people looked when they were about to say something they weren't sure would land. "I wanted to tell you before I did anything." She looked at him. He was 24 and had taken a risk she'd asked him to take without fully understanding what he was walking into, and had done it anyway. "What's the idea?" she asked. He told her. It took about 12 minutes and was, she recognized immediately, actually good. Not polished. He wasn't polished, he was 24 and nervous, but the core of it was solid. The market gap he'd identified was real. The approach was different from what was already in the space. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. "How much of this have you built out?" "Just wireframes. And some initial modeling." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to give you my personal email address, not the work one, and I want you to send me everything you have. What you've built, what you're thinking, all of it." He looked uncertain. "I'm not recruiting you for Novacor," she said. "I'm telling you that whatever you're doing next, I want to be part of the conversation." She paused. "I've been thinking about what's next too. Just send me the material." He sent it that evening. She read it at home, on her couch, with the particular focus she gave things that were worth her focus. She made notes. Then she called Ethan and read him the relevant sections because she'd gotten used to thinking out loud with him, and he'd gotten used to asking the questions that cut to the center. "Do you believe in it?" he asked when she'd finished. "I think it's good," she said. The idea and the person. He took a risk he didn't have to take. That's not the same as believing in it. She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "I believe in it." "Then the question is what you want your life to look like." She looked at her apartment, the art on the walls, the 2 spare furniture, the 41st floor view that she'd barely seen in the past month, the space where she kept her things between work. "Different than this," she said. "Different how?" "Smaller," she said, which surprised her when she said it. "Or not smaller, just less about scale. I built Novacor to a certain size, and I'm proud of that, and I'm going to protect it. But there was a period in the beginning when it was just a few people in a room working on something we didn't know yet if it would work." She stopped. That was the best part, the not knowing, the having to figure it out from the ground up. Ethan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the particular way of someone who was about to say something true that they'd been sitting with for a while. "You should do it," he said, "not instead of Novacor, but after, or alongside, whatever the structure is." A beat. "You're better at building things than at maintaining them. That's not a flaw, it's just what you are." She sat with this. "Is that what you think of me?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are someone who sees what something could be before it is. That's rare. And I think you've been spending a lot of energy on what already exists." He paused. "What would it feel like to start something new?" She closed her eyes. "Like the first day," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Like the first day." She found a small office space on a Tuesday in December, 2 rooms and a reception area on the 6th floor of a building in the Midtown district. Not impressive, not trying to be. She signed a 12-month lease on a Thursday. She called Joel Priya on a Friday and said, "If you haven't taken another job yet, I'd like to have a meeting." "I haven't," he said. "Good. Bring your wireframes." She called Marcus and made him a proposition that he accepted in about 45 seconds, which she took as a sign that he'd been waiting for someone to ask. She had 4 people committed before the new year. She told Ethan over dinner at his apartment, Lily doing homework at the table with headphones on, pasta going on the stove. She laid out the structure, the timeline, the early numbers. He listened. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "You're happy." She looked at him. "I'm terrified." "Yeah," he said. "Same thing, sometimes." Lily pulled one headphone out without looking up. "Are we celebrating something?" "Possibly," Ethan said. "Then can we have ice cream after dinner?" He looked at Sienna. She shrugged. He said, "Sure." Lily put the headphone back in. Normal as anything. The pasta bubbled on the stove and the apartment was warm, and Sienna sat at the small kitchen table where she'd put her hand over his 3 weeks earlier, and she thought about the first day. Not the first day of the company, but the first day of something she didn't have a name for yet that felt like it was going to matter more than any company she'd ever built. The kind of thing that didn't come with evaluation. The kind that came with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and bad coffee and a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, and a man who'd learned to let himself want things again, and a girl who brought hot cocoa to strangers' houses just in case. The kind you built from the ground up. The trial lasted 9 days. Sienna attended 3 of them. The ones her attorney said mattered most, where the financial documentation would be presented and where her testimony was required. She sat in the courtroom in a gray suit she'd chosen deliberately because it was not the power blazer, not the armor, just clothing, and she answered questions clearly and without performance, and she watched Damien Frost across the room do what he'd always done. Manage the room, read the audience, calibrate his expression to whatever the moment required. He was good at it. She'd always known he was good at it, he just wasn't good enough. The account chain she'd found at 4 a.m, cross-referenced with Joel Priya's testimony and David Hart's forensic accounting team, and eventually with the subpoena records that confirmed beneficial ownership of the shell company, it was, as David had told her, airtight. Not in the sense that Damien's lawyers didn't try. They tried everything. They filed 3 separate motions to exclude evidence, challenged the methodology of the forensic accounting, and made an argument about procedural irregularities in the initial SEC contact that was technically creative and ultimately unsuccessful. On the 9th day, the jury took 4 hours and 20 minutes. David called her when the verdict came in. She was at the new office, 2 rooms on the 6th floor of the Midtown building, 4 people around a table that was slightly too large for the space, the particular productive chaos of something in its early stages. She stepped out into the hallway to take the call. "Guilty," David said. "All 7 counts." She stood in the hallway and breathed. "Sentencing?" she asked. 8 to 12 years, most likely, with the financial penalties. His attorneys will push for the lower end. They won't get it. A pause. "It's done, Sienna." She thanked him. She went back into the room. 4 people looked up at her. "Guilty," she said. "All 7. Marcus made a sound. Joel looked at the table for a moment and then looked up, and his expression was complicated in the way of someone who'd taken a risk and come out the other side and wasn't entirely sure yet how to feel about it. The other 2, a product strategist named Ren and a developer named Cassie, who'd come over from Novacore's engineering team, sat quietly for a moment. Then Ren said, "Okay, do we get to celebrate, or are we doing the thing where we all act professional?" "We're doing the thing where we order lunch," Sienna said, "and then we get back to work." "That's basically celebrating," Cassie said. "It's basically celebrating," she agreed. She called Ethan from the parking structure after. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear street noise, the particular ambient of the Eastfield district where he'd taken a job on a commercial retrofit. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. 8 to 12 years, he said. "Yes. How do you feel?" She thought about this on the drive out of the structure, the sun hitting the windshield at the low December angle. "Finished," she said. "Not happy. I don't feel triumphant or whatever I expected to feel. Just finished. Like I've been carrying something for a year and I just set it down." "Yeah," he said. "That's what that feels like." She glanced over at the passenger seat out of habit, though no one was there. "Are you done by 6? "Should be." "Come to dinner. Bring Lily." "She has a thing at 7. "Come before her thing. Just come." A beat. "Okay," he said. "We'll come." She hung up and drove through the December city and thought about what David had said. It's done. 2 words. She'd spent most of a year working toward those 2 words, and now they were here, and the world looked exactly the same as it had this morning, and that was the strange thing about endings. They didn't announce themselves the way you thought they would. They just arrived, quiet and ordinary, in a hallway outside a small office on the 6th floor of a building that was slightly too cold because the HVAC was unreliable, in a phone call in a parking structure, in the act of ordering lunch and getting back to work. She had expected to feel bigger than this. She did not feel bigger than this. She felt mostly like herself, which was, she was slowly understanding, the whole point. Passa. The new company was called Vela. Sienna had spent approximately 3 weeks deciding on the name, which Ethan had found mildly excessive and Lily had found baffling. "It's just a name," Lily had said, with the pragmatism of a 9-year-old, and which she'd defended on the grounds that a name was the first thing a company was, and the first thing mattered. Vela was a constellation. Small, southern sky, mostly unremarkable except for one thing. It contained what astronomers called the Vela supernova remnant, the aftermath of a star that had exploded approximately 12,000 years ago and was still expanding, still moving outward into the dark. She'd explained this to Joel, who was her co-founder, and he'd said, "So our company's name is about an explosion." "It's about what comes after the explosion," she'd said. He'd thought about this. "Okay, I like it." It was also, though she didn't say this out loud, about light that was still traveling. About something that had happened a long time ago, continuing to move forward, reaching places it couldn't have anticipated. She thought about Claire's photograph on Ethan's shelf. She thought about a woman she'd never met who had left a daughter with her father's steadiness and her own fearless way of walking into any room and making space. She thought about things that kept going, even after. Boom. Vela's first product launched in the spring, 8 months after she'd signed the lease on the sixth-floor office. It was not a perfect launch. The server architecture had a load balancing issue they hadn't caught in testing that Cassie had to fix in real time during the first 72 hours, which meant Cassie essentially didn't sleep for 3 days and communicated primarily in short, urgent sentences. The press coverage was modest. They weren't a $3 billion company. They were 6 people and a product with a specific market application. And the technology press covered them in the way they covered things that might matter later rather than things that mattered now. But the early user data was real. The engagement numbers held. The problem they were solving turned out to be the problem they thought they were solving, which was not a given. Joel had spent 3 months convinced they'd identified the wrong pain point, and Sienna had spent those same 3 months trying to trust the original thesis while simultaneously taking the concern seriously, because that was the specific tension of building something. You had to believe and doubt at the same time, and the balance between them was everything. By summer, they had 12 employees. By fall, 20. The office had moved to a larger space in the same building, 3rd floor, more windows, still slightly cold because the HVAC in the building was, Ethan had confirmed after an unofficial inspection, genuinely underperforming, and they should talk to the building management about it. Richard Calloway's office called in October. His chief of staff said he'd be interested in a brief meeting. She went. He was in his usual position, behind a desk that probably cost more than her first year's salary, in an office with a view that made her 41st floor look modest. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the charity gala, measuring and not unkind. "I hear Vela is doing well," he said. "We're doing okay." "You're being modest. The Series A number I heard was substantial." "The Series A number you heard is not public." He smiled. "No, it's not." He poured tea from a pot on his desk, offered her a cup, which she accepted. "I wanted to tell you something. A few months ago, before everything with Frost became public, I had a conversation with 2 other board members about whether to wait and see how things unfolded with Novacor, or whether to, quietly, carefully, begin positioning around you personally." She held her cup. "And?" "We decided to wait. I want to be honest about that. We weren't sure you'd come out of it intact." "I appreciate the honesty. You came out of it considerably more intact than I expected," he said. "And what you've built at Vela in 8 months is... it's not what I expected either." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to invest. Not through the usual channels, personally." She looked at him for a moment. This was real money. Old structure money. The kind that opened doors that other money couldn't quite reach. That brought with it a network of relationships built over 50 years. She also knew what it came with. She'd learned, the hard way, what it meant to have people inside your structure who had their own agenda. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "What would you want in return?" "A board seat," he said. "Advisory, not operational. I'm not interested in running anything. I'm interested in watching what you build." She thought about it. She thought about the way he'd sent her that gold-embossed invitation to the gala, about the message with no punctuation that had bought her a day she'd needed, about the fact that he'd moved on information before she'd asked him to, because he'd decided she was worth moving for. "I'll need to talk to my co-founder," she said. "Of course. And I'll need the terms in writing by end of week, because I have 4 other conversations I'm managing and I don't have bandwidth to let this sit." He nodded approvingly. "End of week," he said. She shook his hand and walked out and called Joel from the elevator and said, "How do you feel about Richard Calloway?" Joel said, "Is this hypothetical or actual?" "Actual." A pause. "I feel like I'd want to know what he wants." "I'll tell you everything. Coffee in an hour?" "I'll be there." She told Ethan that evening. They were at his apartment. This was a regular thing now. The rhythm of the week had organized itself around certain constants, and his kitchen table on Tuesday or Thursday evenings was one of them. Lily was doing the dishes with the specific negotiated chore energy of a 9-year-old who had agreed to this arrangement but had opinions about the order of operations. She laid out the Calloway conversation while Ethan made tea. He listened. "Do you trust him?" he asked. "I trust that he acts in his own interest, which in this case aligns with mine." "That's not the same as trusting him." "No, but in business it's often better. People who act in their own interest are predictable. It's the ones who tell you they're acting in yours that you have to watch. Ethan considered this. That's a depressing worldview. It's an accurate one. Does it have to be both? She looked at him. He was pouring tea with the same attention he gave everything, precise and unhurried, and she thought about the fact that this was what he was. Someone who believed that things could be both accurate and worth doing anyway. That the honest version of the world and the hopeful version weren't necessarily opposites. She'd spent a long time believing they were. Take the investment, he said, but make sure Joel has full information, and make sure you're the one who sets the terms of the board seat. That was already my plan. I know. I'm just saying it out loud so you hear it from someone who's not trying to close a deal. Lily, from the sink, without turning around. Dad, should I put the big pot in the cabinet or leave it on the stove? Cabinet. The cabinet's full. Then make room. How? Figure it out. A brief silence. The sound of cabinet reorganization. Lily said, Okay, I figured it out. Good. Sienna looked at the two of them and felt something move through her chest that was not triumph and not relief, and was not the complicated satisfaction of a business win. It was simpler than any of those things and harder to name. The closest she could get was here. She was here. This was real. The kitchen table and the bad cabinet organization, and the tea and the man who said things out loud so she could hear them from someone not trying to close a deal. She'd spent so long building things that she'd forgotten this was also a thing you could build. The Technology Awards ceremony happened on a Tuesday in February, 2 years and 4 months after a maintenance contractor named Ethan Cross had walked into a boardroom intercom and told a CEO to eat her lunch. Vela had been nominated for 2 awards, Emerging Company of the Year and Product Innovation in Enterprise Technology. Sienna had not expected to win either. She'd attended award ceremonies enough times to understand that nominations at this scale were their own category of recognition, separate from winning, and she'd made peace with that somewhere around the time the invitation arrived. She won both. The first one she accepted at the table, which was tradition. Smaller categories. The presenter read the winner, and you stood and said something brief. She said something brief. She was good at brief. The second one was the main stage. She'd prepared remarks. She'd been preparing remarks for 2 days, which was unusual. She could usually put together a speech in a few hours. But she'd kept starting and stopping because what she'd written kept feeling like the wrong thing to say. Like she was writing the version of the story that made sense in a press release instead of the version that was true. She threw the prepared remarks out at 10:30 the night before. She sat at her kitchen island, the same island where she'd spread financial documents on a Sunday morning almost 2 years ago, where she'd eaten soup alone at midnight, where she'd found the account chain at 4 a.m, and she thought about what was actually true, what this had actually been. Not the headline version, the real one. The real one involved a flickering light in a corridor, and a maintenance request filed twice, and a man who showed up early because he thought flickering lights made hard things harder for people who were already going through hard things. It involved bad coffee and a sticky note that said, "Eat it," and a girl who packed hot cocoa for strangers. It involved 4 a.m. and encrypted drives and a drawing with 3 figures holding hands and a park bench in November and the particular quality of a silence that had weight in it. It involved learning, slowly and with difficulty, that the people who were worth the most to you were usually the ones who didn't want anything from you except for you to be okay. She wrote 3 paragraphs. That was all she needed. The main stage was larger than she'd expected, or maybe she was smaller than she usually felt in rooms like this. The audience was several hundred people. Executives, investors, technologists, journalists, the assembled machinery of an industry she'd spent her career inside. She walked to the podium. She looked out at the room. She saw Marcus in the 3rd row, who'd come because she'd asked him, and because he was the kind of person who showed up when you asked. She saw Joel and Cassie and Ren at a table near the back, Joel looking slightly uncomfortable in a suit he hadn't fully committed to, Cassie with her arms crossed in the way she had when she was paying close attention. She saw Richard Calloway 2 tables over, watching with the measuring patience of someone who'd been doing this for a long time and found it, still, worth watching. She saw at a round table near the side of the room Ethan in a jacket she'd never seen before, which meant he'd bought it for tonight, which meant something she didn't have words for. Lily was beside him in a blue dress she'd picked herself and had told Sienna about 3 times in the preceding week. They both looked slightly out of place in the way of people who hadn't spent careers learning to look comfortable in rooms like this, and she found this the most comforting thing in the room. She put the 3 paragraphs she'd written on the podium. Then she folded them and put them in her pocket. She spoke without notes. "I've been told that at events like this you're supposed to talk about vision," she said, "about innovation, disruption, market opportunity, the language of what we do." She paused. "I'm going to talk about something else." The room was quiet in the way of a room that had been expecting one thing and was adjusting to receiving another. 2 years ago, my company was under attack from the inside. I'd built something over years and watched someone systematically try to take it apart, and I was in the middle of a very bad week when a maintenance contractor walked into an electrical panel room and I said something to him I didn't intend for him to hear. She stopped. I called him honey over the intercom, in front of my entire board of directors. A ripple of recognition through the room. The story had made the rounds, not in detail, but the shape of it. He didn't apologize. He didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He just looked up and said, "Only if you've already eaten lunch, gotten some sleep, and stopped working yourself into the ground." She let that sit for a moment. No one in my professional life had ever said anything like that to me, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't stop thinking about it. She looked out at the room, at Joel, who was not uncomfortable anymore, at Marcus, who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who knew this story from the inside. I had a company. I had a position. I had everything that people in this room work for their whole careers to build, and I was also, in ways I hadn't admitted to myself, completely alone. She said it without self-pity, just straight. I didn't have anyone who would tell me to eat lunch. I didn't have anyone who would say hard things because they thought I was worth the effort of saying them to. I'd built walls because walls were efficient, and I didn't have time for anything that wasn't efficient. A pause. And then I met a man who wasn't interested in any of the things I had, who couldn't be impressed by any of the things I'd built, and who had the particular skill of saying exactly what was true without making it about himself at all. She reached for the glass of water on the podium. Her hands were steady. "I want to tell you that I built Vela because of a great business insight, or a market gap, or a product vision. Those things are real. But the actual reason I was able to build anything after what happened 2 years ago is that I had people who showed up." She looked toward the side table. "A man who refused to disappear when I suggested it would be cleaner if he did. A 9-year-old who brought me a drawing of 3 people holding hands on the worst day of my professional life and said, 'We are your people.' Colleagues who stayed when staying cost something." Lily, at the side table, was sitting completely still, which anyone who knew her would understand was unusual and meant she was paying very close attention. "The smartest decision I ever made," Sienna said, "was not building a company. It was accidentally calling this man honey." The room laughed. Some of it was the surprise of it, the sincerity where ceremony was expected. Some of it was the particular relief of hearing something true said out loud in a room that had been expecting something polished. She looked at Ethan. He was shaking his head, slightly, with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and still found the experience of it unexpectedly large. "Will you two come up here?" she said. The room shifted. A few hundred people turning to look at the table near the side, at the man in the new jacket and the girl in the blue dress. Lily looked at her father. Her father looked at the stage. Then he stood up, because he was Ethan Cross, and when something was asked of him, he showed up, and he took Lily's hand and they walked through the room toward the stage. The walk took about 45 seconds. Sienna watched them the whole time. When they reached the stage, Lily came first, which was right, and she stood next to Sienna with her hands folded in front of her and looked out at the audience with the serene confidence of someone who had always known she belonged wherever she decided to stand. Ethan came up beside her and stood close, but not too close, and looked at Sienna with an expression she knew, the one without performance, without calculation, entirely present. "Hi," he said, quietly enough that the microphone barely caught it. "Hi," she said. She looked at the audience, back at him. She had not planned what happened next. She had thought briefly about this moment, but she hadn't planned it because planning it would have made it a performance, and she was done performing things that should just be real. She reached into her jacket pocket. The ring had been her grandmother's. Not the kind of thing she'd expected to use, not the kind of thing she'd been keeping specifically for this, but when she'd found it in the box in her closet 3 weeks ago while looking for something else, she'd looked at it for a long time and then put it in her pocket and left it there. Simple gold band, small stone, the kind of thing made in an era when things were built to last and not to be impressive. She held it out. Ethan looked at it, then at her, then at Lily, who had the expression of someone watching a hypothesis confirmed for the second time and who was, visibly, trying extremely hard not to smile. "I'm not good at asking for things," Sienna said, still quiet, still real. "You know that. You figured that out approximately the second week we knew each other." She kept her eyes on his. "But I'm asking, because you told me once that you hadn't let yourself have things you wanted in a long time, and I want to be one of those things. I want to be something you let yourself have." Ethan looked at the ring for a moment, then at her, then at Lily, who had completely given up on not smiling and was now smiling fully and freely in the way she did most things. "She's been waiting for you to do this for 6 months, he said. "I know," Sienna said. "Lily told me." "Lily?" "I didn't say anything," Lily said, in a tone that suggested she had said something, just technically within the bounds of plausible deniability. Ethan looked at the ceiling briefly, the way he did when his daughter had outmaneuvered him. Then he looked at Sienna. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." The room erupted. She put the ring on his hand, the left hand with the scarred knuckles and the slightly crooked finger and the evidence of everything he'd held together for a long time alone. And he covered it with his right hand and looked at her, and the look was the same one he'd given her in an electrical panel room when she was still figuring out what kind of person he was, just without any of the careful distance. Lily said, at normal speaking volume into the still live microphone, "I told him to buy the ring first, but he said it was her job." The room laughed again, louder, the real kind. Ethan put his face in his hand briefly. Sienna laughed for real. Not the controlled version, not the professional one, just the one that came out when something genuinely surprised her into it. She picked up the award from the podium. She looked at it for a moment and then at the room. "Thank you," she said simply, and walked off the stage with the award in one hand and Ethan's hand in the other, and Lily slightly ahead of them, because Lily was always slightly ahead. They married in June. Small, which had been the plan from the beginning. A lakeside property 2 hours from the city, owned by a friend of Richard Calloway's who'd offered it with the particular generosity of someone who understood that some things were worth making space for. 40 people, maybe 45. The guest list had grown by 7 between when they'd first written it and the day itself, because that was what happened when you tried to be intentional about who mattered and kept remembering someone you'd forgotten. Monica cried during the ceremony, which she would have denied if asked. Marcus gave a toast that was funny for the first 2 minutes and genuine for the last one, and sat down to applause. Joel brought his girlfriend and spent most of the reception talking to Cassie about a product issue they both swore they weren't thinking about. Richard Calloway attended and shook Ethan's hand with the gravity of someone conferring respect he'd decided was earned, which Ethan accepted without performance, which Richard visibly appreciated. David Hart came with his wife and drank exactly 2 glasses of wine and left at a reasonable hour and shook Sienna's hand at the door and said, "You did well," which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Lily wore yellow, her choice, and took the role of flower girl with the thoroughness she brought to everything, which meant she'd researched optimal petal distribution patterns and had opinions about the spacing. She'd also, without telling anyone, written something she wanted to say during the ceremony. She'd asked Sienna 2 weeks before if she could, and Sienna had said of course, and then spent the following 2 weeks wondering what Lily had written and not asking because she understood that Lily needed it to be hers until she gave it away. When the moment came, Lily stood up with a piece of paper she'd folded into quarters and unfolded carefully and held with both hands. She said, "My dad told me once that the secret to scrambled eggs is to almost stop stirring right at the end. I think that's true about a lot of things. You work really hard and then you have to trust it. She paused, reading. I'm glad you called him honey, because he is one. He's just the kind that you have to look carefully to see. She looked up from the paper, looked at Sienna directly. I'm glad you looked carefully. She sat down, folded the paper back into quarters, put it in the pocket of her yellow dress. The 45 people around the lake were very quiet for a moment. Ethan had his jaw tight in the way he got when something was difficult to hold. Sienna reached over and took his hand and held it the way she had at his kitchen table. Palm to palm, steady. Okay, the officiant said after a moment. Should we continue? Yeah, Ethan said. His voice was rougher than usual. Sorry, yeah. The ceremony continued. They said the things you said, which were old words, worn smooth by use, and which were true anyway, which was the thing about old words. Their age was the evidence that they'd carried weight before and could carry it again. Sienna said hers without notes. Ethan said his with them, a single index card he'd written on and rewritten 4 times, which he'd told her about and which she'd found more moving than any unrehearsed declaration would have been. The fact that he'd written it down because he wanted to get it right. He got it right. When it was over, they walked out past the 45 people and down to the lake, which was still and gray-green in the June light, and stood at the edge of it for a moment. You okay? She asked. Yeah. He looked at the water. You? Yeah. Lily appeared between them with the precision of someone who had been timing her arrival. She took one of each of their hands without asking, looked at the lake and said, The water's cold. I checked earlier. We're not going in the water, Ethan said. I know. I just thought you should have all the information. Sienna looked at the lake, at the tree line on the opposite bank, at the 45 people behind them in the slow, complicated process of becoming her life. She thought about what she'd have said 2.5 years ago if someone had described this exact scene to her. She probably would have said it sounded nice, but that she didn't have the bandwidth for nice right now. She probably would have said she had a company to run and a board to manage and a merger to close, and maybe in a few years, maybe when things settled down. Things didn't settle down. That was the thing she'd learned, slowly and with difficulty, that she wanted to say to anyone who would listen. Things didn't settle down and then become available for the rest of your life to fit inside. You had to build the rest of your life at the same time, in the same hours, in the same days that were never going to be less full than they were right now. You had to choose what was real while you were in the middle of everything else. She'd been in the middle of everything else when a flickering light got her attention. When a maintenance request made 2 weeks earlier and ignored twice got someone to the 34th floor of the Callaway Tower with a toolbox and an absence of deference that she'd found, initially, startling and then, gradually, essential. She hadn't been looking for anything. That was the truth of it. She'd been running at full speed in the direction she'd always been running, and someone had stepped into the corridor and said, "Only if you've already eaten lunch." And for some reason, she still couldn't fully explain why, she'd stopped trying. She'd heard it. She'd actually heard it. And then she hadn't been able to unhear it, and the rest had followed. She thought about the things that saved you that you didn't see coming. The small interruptions that turned out to be the main event. The flickering light that gets you in the room. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who wasn't looking for anything from you. That was the rarest thing. That was the thing she hadn't known she was missing until she had it, and then couldn't imagine having done without. And she thought about Lily's 3 paragraphs. You work really hard and then you have to trust it. And about how a 9-year-old had managed to say in 10 words what she'd spent 30 years of living working toward. Almost stopped stirring right at the end. Trust the thing you built. Vela cleared $1 billion in valuation 14 months after launch. Sienna found out on a Wednesday morning in a conference call with their investors, and she said thank you and then hung up and sat at her desk for a moment, and then went to get coffee and came back and kept working because that was what you did. She told Ethan that evening. He was fixing something under their kitchen sink. They'd been in the new apartment for 4 months, larger than his had been and smaller than hers had been, which was either a compromise or exactly right. And he said, "Huh," from inside the cabinet and then asked her to hand him a wrench. She handed him the wrench. "Is that good?" he asked. "From under the sink?" "Yes," she said. That's very good. Okay. A sound of something being tightened. Is dinner still at 7? Lily said 6:30 because she has homework after. Right. A pause. Good, Sienna. Seriously. She sat on the kitchen floor next to the open cabinet. I know. You should feel good about it. I do. I also feel like it's Wednesday and there's a leak under the sink and Lily has homework. He came out from under the cabinet, looked at her sitting on the floor. His expression did the thing she'd cataloged over 2 years. The slight shift at the corner of the mouth, the warmth underneath the steadiness. Yeah, he said. That's kind of what it is. She thought about the first day. Not the first day of the company. The day in the electrical panel room when she'd stood in the doorway of a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and warm metal and looked at a man who was entirely focused on the thing in front of him and thought, I don't know what this is, but it's something. She thought about what Richard Callaway had said. I wanted to see what you'd build. And she thought about what she'd built. Not the company, not the valuation, not the awards or the board seats or the industry recognition. She thought about the kitchen sink and the homework at 6:30 and the yellow dress in a closet down the hall and the photograph of a woman still on a shelf because some things didn't go away and shouldn't. She thought about what you could build in the same hours as everything else, in the middle of the full days that were never going to get less full. She thought about all the people running as fast as they could in the direction they'd always been running, and all the flickering lights they were walking past. Ethan was still looking at her. You good? He asked. Yeah, she said. I'm good. She meant it completely. That was the whole story. Not the billion-dollar valuation and not the guilty verdict and not the technology awards and not the lakeside ceremony in June, though all of those things were part of it. The whole story was a woman who had spent years building walls because walls were efficient, and a man who'd spent years holding things together because there was no one else to do it. And the specific Tuesday when the walls met the steadiness, and something happened that neither of them had been looking for or prepared for or knew how to name at first. The whole story was that you could be in the middle of everything. The worst professional crisis of your life, the lawsuit, the counter-accusations, the 4 a.m. desperation. And someone could show up with pasta and homework and a child in a yellow dress who'd done her research on pedal distribution, and that would be the real thing. That would be the thing that mattered more than everything you were in the middle of. The whole story was that nobody gets there cleanly. You show up with your crooked finger and your grocery store coffee and your 4 years of sitting outside your daughter's door in the dark. You show up with your empty apartment and your walls and the decade of believing that being loved was something you'd get to later, when things were less complicated. And then later is now, and the sink is leaking, and dinner is at 6:30, and you're sitting on the kitchen floor and you're not alone, and the thing you built is real. And that is, against all reasonable expectation, more than enough. It is, in fact, everything.